The heavy timber wagon skidded violently sideways across the frozen mud, the draft horses screaming in pure, blind terror. Frost-caked breath exploded in the twilight as a massive gray wolf clamped its jaws around the lead horse's harness. Thaddeus roared, his colossal shoulders straining against the heavy leather reins, hauling back with enough raw strength to snap a lesser man's spine. He reached blindly for the Winchester rifle at his feet. But a second gray blur slammed into the side of the wagon, rocking the heavy oak frame. Wood splintered. Snarls echoed through the freezing, shadowed gorge. He thrust his massive arm out to shield the woman beside him. The mail-order bride he had collected from the distant train station barely an hour ago. The letters from her uncle had promised a delicate, fragile housewife, a soft creature needing absolute protection from the brutal harshness of the mountain frontier. The woman beside him was none of those things. Before Thaddeus could unholster his weapon, Elowen lunged. She did not scream. She did not cower behind his broad back, standing nearly as tall as Thaddeus himself. Her profoundly muscled shoulders tore the delicate seams of the ill-fitting homespun dress she had been forced to wear. She vaulted over the high wooden side of the wagon, her heavy work boots slamming into the frozen earth. With a bone-rattling thud, Thaddeus froze, his hand hovering over his rifle, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight unfolding in the snow. Elowen snatched a fallen, frozen oak branch from the muddy road, a timber so thick and heavy it would have taken a seasoned lumberjack 2 hands merely to drag it. Elowen swung it with one arm. The heavy wood cracked fiercely against the ribs of the leaping wolf, sending the snarling beast tumbling backward into the deep snowdrifts. With a sharp, breathy yelp, another wolf, larger and desperate with winter hunger, lunged for her throat. Elowen dropped the branch. She met the beast in midair. Her massive, calloused hands forged in the grueling, blistering heat of a Pennsylvania steel mill, gripped the thick fur and loose skin of the predator's neck. Muscles the size of riverstones bulged visibly along her thick arms as she roared back at the animal. Twisting her hips with sheer, unadulterated power, she hurled the heavy predator entirely over her shoulder, sending it crashing into a cluster of dead pines. The remaining pack hesitated, their yellow eyes darting between the terrified horses and the towering woman standing between them. They looked at the giant man, now leveling his heavy rifle from the wagon, and then back at the giant woman standing in the blood-stained snow, her chest heaving, her large fists tightly clenched. Sensing the overwhelming physical dominance before them, the wolves turned and melted like ghosts into the dark, encroaching forest. Sometimes, the harsh frontier gives us exactly what we need, wrapped tightly in the disguise of our deepest expectations. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet tales of unexpected strength, hidden scars, and giant hearts finding their place in a hard world, most warmly invite you to like this video, subscribe to our campfire, and share in the comments below how you would react if the delicate bride you expected turned out to be a fierce, towering protector. Let us return to the chill of the mountain air. The silence that followed the attack was absolute, broken only by the frantic, heavy panting of the draft horses and the crunch of Elowen's boots in the snow. The adrenaline began to crash, leaving the bitter winter wind to reclaim the gorge. Elowen's immediate instinct was not to celebrate her survival, nor to seek comfort. She stepped heavily toward the lead horse. Her massive, dust-covered hands reached out. The horse flinched, eyes rolling in terror, but Elowen merely rested her broad palm gently against the animal's lathered neck. A low, rhythmic murmur slipped from her lips, a soothing, maternal hum that vibrated with unexpected tenderness. She stepped closer, exhaling her warm breath gently near the horse's nostrils, a practiced, calming gesture that instantly settled the trembling beast. Her hands, large enough to crush a man's jaw, stroked the horse's mane with the absolute fragility of a falling leaf. Thaddeus slowly lowered his rifle. He remained motionless on the wagon bench, a mountain of a man entirely captivated by the towering woman before him. He had spent weeks mentally preparing himself to care for a fragile, timid creature. The letters he carried in his coat pocket were filled vague kep itahat, elegant handwriting, describing a petite, delicate flower who loved needlepoint and required a strong, capable husband to shield her from the wind. He had built extra shutters for the cabin. He had purchased the softest wool blankets from the trading post. He stared at Eloise Broad, heaving back. Her dress was ruined. The torn fabric exposing shoulders and biceps layered with thick, heavy muscle, node. Currently glistening ve kepi tehat sweat and dusted with white snow. She looked wild. She looked untamed. She looked utterly magnificent. Realizing the danger had fully passed, a profound wave of shame suddenly washed over Eloise. The protective fire in her eyes extinguished, replaced by a quiet, devastating vulnerability. She crossed her thick arms tightly over her chest, her broad shoulders hunching inward, as if desperately trying to make her colossal frame appear smaller. It was a subtle, heartbreaking habit, forged by a lifetime of stares, whispers, and the cruel reality of never fitting the world's mold for what a woman should be. She turned back to face the wagon, her intense hazel eyes dropping to the muddy floorboards. She waited for the inevitable. She waited for the giant man on the bench to curse her, to demand an explanation for her uncle's lies, to turn the wagon around and leave her at the lonely station. Thaddeus did none of those things. He stepped down from the wagon, the heavy springs groaning as his massive weight lifted. He walked toward her, his boots crunching methodically in the snow. When he stood before her, the sheer scale of their combined presence seemed to dwarf the surrounding trees. He was perhaps the only man she had ever met whom she did not have to look down to see. Their eyes met on a level plane. He did not look at her with disgust. He did not look at her as a deception. His piercing gray eyes studied her with a profound, unspoken awe. Without a single word, Thaddeus reached up and unbuttoned his heavy, fleece-lined duster. He slipped the massive garment off his broad shoulders and stepped closer, draping it gently over Eloise. The coat, tailored for a giant, fit her perfectly, swallowing the cold and wrapping her in the lingering, comforting scent of wood smoke and pine. He extended his thick, leather-gloved hand toward her, palm open, an offering of equal footing rather than a demand of submission. Swallowing hard against the sudden tightness in her throat, Eloise placed her massive, rough hand into his. He helped her step back up onto the heavy wagon, his grip firm, steady, and anchoring. They sat side by side as Thaddeus clicked his tongue, urging the calmer horses back into a slow, steady pull up the winding mountain trail. The silence between them was no longer hollow. It was thick, charged with the sudden dismantling of everything they thought they kept about each other. The lantern swinging from the front post cast long, flickering shadows over them. As the dim light washed across Eloise's form, Thaddeus caught sight of something dark and wet, spreading rapidly down the sleeve of the coat he had given her. The fabric was soaked. The wolf's teeth had found their mark during the chaotic tangle. His brow furrowed in quiet alarm. He reached out his massive hand to inspect her arm, intending to assess the wound. The moment his fingers brushed the heavy wool, Eloise violently flinched. She yanked her arm away, her jaw locking in sudden, terrified defiance. She clamped her opposite hand over the bleeding tear, pulling the fabric painfully tight against her skin. But she was not fast enough. In the brief moment the torn sleeve had shifted, the lantern light did not just reveal the fresh, bleeding puncture of a wolf bite. Beneath the fresh blood, etched deep into the heavy, thick muscle of her forearm, was a jagged, brutal, silvered scar. It was a massive, unnatural wound, older, darker, and far more violent than the bite of any wild animal. She turned her face away into the biting wind, hiding her eyes, fiercely guarding a pain that had absolutely nothing to do with the wolves. Thaddeus gripped the reins, his jaw tightening as the cold wind howled through the pines. What deep, unspeakable wound was this giant woman hiding? And what kind of monster had managed to hurt someone so undeniably unbreakable? The heavy timber cabin sat high on the timberline, a solitary fortress of massive, notched pine logs built to withstand the crushing weight of the mountain winters. Smoke curled from the fieldstone chimney, a gray ribbon against the bruised purple of the night sky. Thaddeus brought the exhausted horses to a halt near the heavy oak door. He did not ask Elowen to wait, nor did he offer a hand to help her step down. He had already learned that the towering woman beside him required no such coddling. Instead, he simply unlatched the wagon gate and gave a single, respectful nod toward the porch. Stepping inside, the air was thick with the scent of aged cedar, wood ash, and the faint, sweet aroma of cured tobacco. The cabin was distinctly the domain of a giant. The chairs were built wide and low, the table crafted from a single, massive slab of polished elm, and the doorways framed extra high to accommodate a man who had to duck in standard dwellings. For the first time in her life, Elowen stood beneath a roof where her colossal, heavily muscled frame did not feel like an intrusion. Yet, as the warmth of the cast-iron stove began to thaw the frost from her eyelashes, a crushing wave of panic settled deep in her chest. Her uncle's voice echoed sharply in her memory. A cruel, metallic rasp forged in the heat of the steel mills. Make yourself useful, girl. Hide those monstrous arms. Speak softly. Act the delicate part, or no man will ever tolerate the sight of you. She had to prove her worth. She had to fulfill the duties of the soft, domestic bride Thaddeus had paid for. Before he realized the monumental extent of the fraud, Elowen shrugged off Thaddeus's heavy duster, shivering as the cold air bit through the torn shoulder of her ruined homespun dress. Ignoring the sharp, pulsing ache of the wolf bite on her forearm, she forced herself into motion. Her intense hazel eyes darted around the masculine room, eventually landing on a small, startlingly out-of-place wooden sideboard. Arranged delicately on a hand-crocheted lace doily was a pristine, fragile porcelain tea service. The cups were eggshell-thin, painted with tiny blue cornflowers. Thaddeus had traveled 3 days to a lower settlement specifically to purchase them, believing his new breed would find the rough tin mugs of a mountain lager deeply offensive. Desperate to show her domestic grace, Elowen approached the sideboard. She reached out to arrange the delicate cups, intending to prepare a pot of hot water for her new husband. But her massive hands, scarred by molten slag and calloused from years of swinging sledgehammers, were entirely the wrong tools for such fragile beauty. Her thick, trembling fingers fumbled against the delicate handle. She tried to adjust her grip, using far too much of her sheer, unadulterated power. A sharp, sickening crack echoed through the quiet cabin. The delicate porcelain shattered entirely within her palm, bursting into a dozen jagged white shards that rained down onto the lace doily. Elowen froze. The air left her lungs in a sharp gasp. Immediately, she crossed her thick arms over her stomach, her broad, heavily muscled shoulders hunching violently inward as she tried to make her towering frame disappear. It was a deeply ingrained reflex, bracing for the inevitable shout, the cruel reprimand, the disgusted sigh of a man realizing she was nothing but a clumsy, oversized beast. A heavy, measured footstep sounded behind her. Elowen tightly closed her eyes, bowing her head. A massive leather-gloved hand gently entered her field of vision. Thaddeus did not shout. He did not sigh. Without a single sound of frustration, he carefully reached past her rigid body. His thick, rough fingers moved with surprising dexterity, methodically sweeping the broken porcelain shards into his palm. When the doily was clear, he turned his body, physically blocking her from the remaining fragile cups. He took a heavy, battered tin mug from a hook on the wall, filled it with hot water from the stove kettle, and placed it firmly into Elowen's massive hands. The tin was warm, solid, and utterly unbreakable. "Drink," he rumbled softly, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated deeply within his broad chest. It was the first word he had spoken to her since the wolf attack, and it carried absolutely no judgment. Elowen exhaled a shaky breath, the tight knot in her chest loosening just a fraction. She cradled the warm tin mug, feeling a sudden, unexpected sting of tears behind her eyes. The quiet dignity he afforded her was foreign. entirely dismantling the defenses she had spent years building around her heart. Thaddeus motioned toward a heavy, oversized rocking chair near the hearth fire. "Sit." Elowen obeyed, sinking into the sturdy wood. The firelight flickered across her strong, angular face, highlighting the deep exhaustion pooling beneath her intense hazel eyes. Thaddeus moved to a heavy oak cabinet, retrieving a simple wooden lockbox, a roll of clean cotton bandages, a needle, thread, and a clear glass bottle of high-proof whiskey. He pulled a small wooden stool close to the rocking chair and sat down facing her. Their massive knees nearly brushed. The physical proximity was overwhelming. The sheer scale of their bodies made the intimate space between them feel incredibly charged, radiating a quiet, static heat. Thaddeus reached out, his open palm hovering just above her bleeding arm. He waited. He did not force his touch upon her. He offered the silent request, allowing her the agency to accept or refuse his care. Slowly, Elowen uncurled her thick arm from her chest, resting her massive wrist within his palm. Thaddeus gently pushed the torn, blood-soaked fabric of her sleeve higher. He paused. The firelight illuminated the fresh, jagged puncture wounds from the wolf's teeth, but his piercing gray eyes immediately locked onto the horrific silvered scar running beneath it. It was a massive burn. The flesh puckered and twisted in a way that spoke of unimaginable heat and absolute agony. Elowen tensed, her breathing turning shallow. She looked away, staring fixedly into the dancing flames of the hearth, waiting for the questions. She waited for him to demand the story of how a woman became so monstrously disfigured. Thaddeus merely uncorked the whiskey bottle. "This will bite," he murmured. He tipped the bottle, pouring the stinging alcohol directly over the fresh puncture wounds. Elowen's jaw locked. The heavy muscles of her forearm jumped involuntarily, flexing with sheer, intimidating power under his grip. But she did not pull away. She did not make a sound. Thaddeus' calloused thumb gently wiped away the excess blood. His touch, reverent, moving over the old, violent scar with the exact same tenderness he applied to the unblemished skin. He threaded the needle with meticulous, steady movements. He began to stitch the torn flesh. For a man accustomed to wielding heavy axes and wrestling felled timber, his hands possessed an extraordinary gentleness. He drew the thread taut, closing the wound avec hot, quiet, rhythmic precision. Elowen watched his scarred, thick fingers work. She felt a profound alien sense of emotional safety settling over her. For the first time in her life, a man was touching her not in violence, not in labor, and not in disgust, but in quiet, absolute care. When he finished tying off the heavy thread, he wrapped her thick bicep in the clean white cotton, pulling it snug. Thaddeus rose slowly, gathering the bloody water bowl and the whiskey bottle. He turned his broad back to her, moving toward the heavy wash basin in the corner of the cabin to clean the tools. Wanting to be useful, wanting to show some measure of gratitude, Elowen reached out her uninjured arm to clear the small table beside the rocking chair. Her thick, nosed, heavy forearm brushed against the small wooden lockbox Thaddeus had left behind. The box tipped. Elowen lunged to catch it, but her massive, stiff fingers fumbled. The box tumbled off the edge of the table, hitting the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. The brass hinge snapped, and the contents spilled across the floorboards. In a chaotic flutter of white paper, Elowen dropped to her knees, her heavy boots scraping against the floor as she scrambled to gather the mess. Her hand hovered over the scattered papers. They were letters. She froze, her heart violently slamming against her ribs. She recognized the elegant, sweeping handwriting instantly. It was her uncle's script. Trembling, she picked up the top page. The firelight illuminated the ink, and her eyes scanned the meticulously crafted lies that had brought her to this mountain. "My dear Thaddeus," Mote send you my fragile flower. Elawin. She is petite, soft-spoken, and delicate in all her ways. She possesses a timid heart, requiring a strong man to shield her small, frail frame from the world's harshness. Elowin's breath hitched. She stared down at her own massive, heavily muscled, scarred hands resting against the floorboards. She was a towering giant forged in a blistering steel mill. A woman who had just hurled a starving wolf through the air. The devastating realization crashed over her with the force of a falling pine. Thaddeus hadn't bought her a delicate tea set because he was kind. He had bought it because he had been promised a delicate woman. A woman he was supposed to protect. Not a wild beast who bled over his floors. A heavy silence descended over the cabin. Thaddeus had stopped washing his hands. Elowin looked up slowly, clutching the letters in her massive, trembling fist, to find his piercing gray eyes staring down at Mote Fether from across the room. The scattered letters lay against the rough floorboards, their elegant, curling ink illuminated by the flickering hearth. Elowin knelt amidst the damning evidence of her uncle's lies, her massive shoulders hunched inward in that heartbreaking, familiar posture of expected defeat. She clutched the top page, her calloused, heavily muscled fingers trembling violently against the fragile parchment. Thaddeus stood across the room, an unmoving mountain of a man. His piercing gray eyes dropped from her terrified face to the papers scattered around her heavy boots. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, interrupted only by the wind howling against the frosted window panes. Slowly, methodically, Thaddeus crossed the room. His heavy leather boots made no sound of anger, only a steady, rhythmic approach. He knelt before her, his massive frame folding downward until he was entirely level with her lowered gaze. He did not ask to read the letter in her hand. He did not demand an explanation for the delicate facade she had tried and failed to maintain. Instead, dumb-earned, his thick, scarred fingers gently enveloped her trembling, massive hand. He carefully extracted the letter from her grip. Gathering the rest of the scattered pages from the floorboards, he rose to his full, towering height. Elowin braced herself, closing her eyes tightly, waiting for the heavy, crushing disappointment she had seen in the eyes of every man who had ever looked upon her undeniable, giant strength. The heavy cast-iron door of the stove squeaked open. Elowin flinched, her eyes flying open. Thaddeus stood before the roaring fire. Without a single moment of hesitation, without sparing even a glance at the meticulous lies written by her uncle, he tossed the entire stack of letters directly into the hungry flames. The fire flared, consuming the paper in a brilliant, blinding flash of orange heat. The delicate flower her uncle had invented turned rapidly to dark, crumbling ash, floating harmlessly up the fieldstone chimney. Thaddeus closed the iron door with a solid, echoing clang. He turned back to her, his expression deeply stoic, yet his gray eyes radiated a profound, unwavering warmth. "Lies burn," he rumbled, his deep voice carrying the absolute finality of a falling oak. "Stone remains." He offered no further comfort, sensing that words would only crowd the fragile peace settling between them. He merely stepped past her, retrieving a heavy wool blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed, and draped it gently over her broad, shivering shoulders before retreating to his own cot near the far wall. The message was unmistakable. He did not want a fragile flower. He accepted the towering, powerful woman currently occupying his floor. Morning arrived with a bitter, bone-snapping ferocity. Elowin woke to a world encased in solid, glittering ice. The heavy cabin windows were frosted completely opaque, choked with thick, feather-like patterns of rime. Her breath plumed in the freezing air of the cabin. The water in the heavy porcelain wash basin had frozen solid during the night. Cracking the ceramic pitcher straight down the middle, she sat up, the heavy wool blanket slipping from her massively muscled shoulders. The quiet cabin was empty. Thaddeus was already gone. A sharp, rhythmic ringing echoed through the thick timber walls. The unmistakable sound of heavy iron striking frozen wood. Elowen rose, dressing quickly in her thick leather trousers and her heavy, ruined homespun dress, ignoring the tight, pulsing ache in her stitched forearm. She moved to the frosted window, pressing the heat of her broad palm against the glass to melt a small viewing hole. Outside, the mountain was a brutal wind-scoured expanse of blinding white. Thaddeus stood near the timberline, a giant, solitary figure battling a massive, deeply knotted hemlock stump. The wood was practically petrified, frozen into a dense, unyielding block of iron-hard fibers. Thaddeus swung his heavy, splitting axe with terrifying force, his colossal back muscles straining beneath his thick flannel coat. The axe bit into the stump with a deafening crack, but the frozen wood refused to yield. The heavy iron head merely chipped the surface, sending shards of ice flying into the biting air. Thaddeus wrestled the axe free, his broad chest heaving, his breath exploding in thick clouds of white steam. He was exhausted. The long wagon journey, the adrenaline of the wolf attack, and the brutal altitude were actively draining his reserves. Inside the cabin, Elowen began to pace. Her heavy boots thumped rhythmically against the floorboards. Stay inside. Keep warm. Let the man handle the heavy labor. The societal conditioning whispered insidiously in her mind, demanding she remain passive, useless, and hidden from the grueling work. But the suffocating heat of the steel forge still pounded fiercely in her veins. She possessed raw, colossal power that had been shaped by a lifetime of swinging sledgehammers, beside grown men twice her age. She simply could not watch him struggle alone in the freezing dawn. Her jaw locked in sudden, quiet determination. She uncrossed her thick arms, physically rejecting the urge to make herself small. Elowen pushed open the heavy oak door, stepping out into the blinding, sub-zero wind. The cold bit viciously at the exposed, torn shoulder of her dress, but she did not shiver. She strode toward the chopping block, her massive frame moving with the undeniable grace of a seasoned laborer. Thaddeus paused mid-swing, resting the heavy head of the axe against the snow. His dark eyebrows drew together in a silent, questioning frown as she approached. Elowen did not speak. She stepped past him, her eyes fixed entirely on the unyielding, frozen hemlock stump. Resting against the side of the chopping block was a heavy, long-handled splitting maul, a massive iron wedge affixed to a thick hickory shaft, a tool meant only for the strongest of loggers. Her thick, calloused hands wrapped around the smooth hickory handle. She lifted the heavy iron maul with a single, effortless motion, testing the brutal weight of the tool. Thaddeus watched, his breath caught in his throat. He did not reach out to stop her. He did not patronize her vacapte hat warnings of the tool as dangerous weight. He simply stepped back, yielding the space, silently granting her the absolute respect of a fellow worker. Elowen stepped up to the block. She widened her stance, planting her heavy boots firmly in the packed snow. She assessed the twisted, frozen grain of the wood, her sharp eyes finding the microscopic fault line hidden beneath the ice. She inhaled deeply, the freezing air expanding her massive chest. In one explosive, fluid motion, Elowen swung, her deeply muscled shoulders coiled and released with terrifying, kinetic perfection. The thick muscles of her back visibly surged beneath her torn dress. The heavy iron maul blurred into a deadly arc. Crack-crass. The sound was absolute, echoing like a cannon shot across the frozen gorge. The massive, frozen hemlock stump did not just split, it practically exploded into two perfect, symmetrical halves, hitting the snowy ground with a heavy thud. Elowen slowly lowered the maul, her chest rising and falling in an even, powerful rhythm. A faint sheen of sweat gathered at her brow despite the bitter cold. She turned her head, her intense hazel eyes locking onto Thaddeus, waiting to see if her raw, terrifying display of sheer physical dominance had frightened him. Thaddeus stared at the perfectly split wood, and then up at the towering, magnificent woman holding the iron maul. A slow, incredibly rare curve touched the corner of his lips, beneath his thick, wild beard. It was a look of pure, unadulterated admiration. Without a word, Thaddeus reached down, his massive, gloved hands gripping a second, equally unyielding pine stump. He hoisted the colossal weight of the wood, muscles straining, and set it firmly upon the chopping block for her. Elowen's heart swelled with a profound, overwhelming warmth. She raised the maul again. They fell into a silent, rhythmic partnership, two towering giants moving in perfect, unspoken harmony. Thaddeus hauled and set the heavy timber. Elowen swung and split the frozen wood. The brutal, agonizing chore became a beautifully synchronized dance of raw power and mutual, absolute respect. The shame that had burdened Elowen for years began to melt entirely into the frozen earth. Here, on this lonely mountain, her immense strength was not a monstrous deformity. It was a celebrated gift, but the mountain was a master of sudden, violent betrayals. The wind abruptly ceased. The sky, previously a bruised purple, violently shifted into a terrifying, boiling charcoal gray. The temperature plummeted with an unnatural, breath-stealing speed, freezing the sweat instantly on Elowen's skin. A deafening roar cascaded over the distant ridge. A blinding, impenetrable wall of swirling white snow hurtled toward the cabin, swallowing the tree line in an instant. Thaddeus dropped the wood, his eyes widening in alarm. He lunged forward, grabbing Elowen's massive arm and pulling her toward the cabin just as the blizzard slammed into them with the force of a runaway train. They burst through the heavy oak door, throwing their combined, colossal weight against the timber to force it shut against the screaming, violent wind. Thaddeus dropped the heavy iron crossbar into place, plunging the cabin into sudden, terrifying twilight. They stood panting in the dim light, the walls shuddering violently under the unrelenting assault of the storm. Then, a sickening, sharp crack echoed from directly above their heads. Dust and bark rained down from the ceiling. Elowen and Thaddeus looked up simultaneously, their faces draining of color. The central, massive ridge beam supporting the cabin's roof was visibly bowing downward, groaning ominously, beginning to splinter under the catastrophic, sudden weight of the monumental snowpack accumulating above. Another deafening crack tore through the dim cabin, louder and sharper than the first. A heavy shower of dried bark and brittle pine needles rained down, coating the floorboards. The massive central ridge beam, a timber as thick as a man's torso, groaned violently. A deep, jagged fissure appeared along its underside, the wood fibers visibly snapping under the catastrophic weight of the accumulating snowpack above. The blizzard screamed against the heavy oak door, shaking the iron hinges. Nature was demanding entry, and the roof was seconds away from completely caving in. Thaddeus did not panic. His movements were explosive, driven by years of surviving the mountain's brutal temperament. He lunged across the cabin, his heavy boots skidding slightly against the floorboards, making a desperate bid for a thick, unhewn cedar log leaning in the far corner. It was a leftover support post, heavy enough to require a team of mules to drag it up the mountain. He hoisted it onto his massive shoulder, the veins in his neck bulging against the sheer, crushing strain. He spun back toward the center of the room. Above them, the ceiling dipped sharply. The fissure in the central beam split wider, emitting a horrific, tearing sound like a beast tearing meat from bone. The structure was failing faster than Thaddeus could maneuver the heavy cedar log into place. He needed an extra second. He needed a miracle. And Elowen became the miracle. She did not wait for a command. She did not seek permission to enter the fray. Striding directly into the center of the room, positioning herself directly beneath the failing, splintering timber, Elowen widened her stance. She planted her heavy leather boots against the floorboards, digging in with the absolute certainty of an iron anvil. She raised her massive, heavily muscled arms. Her thick hands pressed flat against the sagging ridge beam, just as another terrifying crack echoed through the wood. The roof dropped. Elowen caught it. The sheer monumental weight of the collapsing roof and the mountain snow crashed down onto her upraised palms. Her knees buckled by a fraction of an inch. The breath exploded from her lungs in a sharp, ragged hiss. The heavy, thick muscles of her back, shoulders and arms instantly flared beneath her torn, ruined dress, corded tight with adrenaline and raw, terrifying power. She let out a low, guttural roar of sheer exertion, pushing back against the crushing pressure of the mountain. Wood splinters bit deeply into the calloused skin of her palms, but she refused to yield. She locked her elbows. She became a living pillar of flesh and bone, holding the very ceiling suspended above them. Thaddeus halted. The heavy cedar log balanced upon his shoulder. For a fraction of a second, the stoic, hardened mountain man was paralyzed by pure, unadulterated awe. Standing before him was a towering titan of a woman, her face flushed vecapite hot extreme effort, her jaw locked, her colossal frame successfully bearing a weight that would have instantly crushed any ordinary human. She was not a fragile flower needing his protection. She was an absolute equal, standing shoulder to shoulder with him against the wrath of the frontier. He shook off his stun. The mountain granted no quarter for staring. Thaddeus rushed forward, dragging the heavy cedar post directly beside Elowen. He kicked a small, iron wedge across the floorboards with his boot, positioning it beneath the log. He hoisted the top of the cedar post, aligning it directly beneath the cracked section of the ridge beam. But the post was an inch too tall. The sagging beam blocked it from sliding entirely into a vertical, locking position. Thaddeus looked at Elowen. Sweat beaded on her forehead, tracing lines through the wood dust coating her skin. Her arms trembled under the immense, agonizing strain. Their eyes met in the dim, flickering light of the hearth. There was no need for shouted instructions. In that single, breathless exchange of intense gazes, complete, absolute trust was permanently forged. Thaddeus gave a single, sharp nod. Elowen inhaled a ragged, desperate breath, channeling every ounce of the brutal strength forged in the blistering heat of the Pennsylvania steel mills. She pushed upward. Her massive shoulders surged. The floorboards beneath her boots groaned. Bending under the sheer kinetic force, she was driving upward into the timber. The ceiling creaked, resisting her, fighting her with the dead weight of the winter storm. Slowly, agonizingly, the heavy timber shifted upward. Half an in. An in. Thaddeus slammed his heavy shoulder against the cedar log. The rough bark tore at his flannel shirt, but he drove his massive weight forward, forcing the post beneath the raised beam. With a deafening, final crack, the post wedged tightly into place, locking straight and true. Thaddeus reached out, grabbing Elowen by her thick waist, physically pulling her back just as she released her agonizing hold. The weight of the roof crashed down upon the cedar post. The heavy log shuddered violently, bowing slightly in the middle, but it held. If the terrible groaning of the structure ceased, replaced entirely by the muffled, distant howling of the blizzard outside. They collapsed backward against the heavy oak table, utterly spent. Thaddeus leaned heavily against the wood, his chest heaving, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. Beside him, Elowen mirrored his exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged, rapid gasps. Slowly, the adrenaline began to bleed from the air. The fire in the hearth, nearly forgotten during the chaos, continued to crackle steadily, casting a warm, golden glow across the dust motes, settling heavily in the silence. The physical toll of the feat began to register. Elowen's arms ached with a deep, burning fire. Her hands throbbed violently, the splinters from the rough beam having dug fiercely into her flesh. She looked down at her massive, battered hands, and the familiar, crushing weight of shame suddenly returned. In the heat of the moment, she had forgotten herself. She had exposed the full, terrifying extent of her monstrous strength. No normal woman could hold up a collapsing roof. No normal woman possessed shoulders broad enough to shame a lumberjack. The absolute terror of his impending rejection clamped around her throat like an iron vise. True to her deepest, most guarded habit, Elowen slowly crossed her thick arms over her chest. She tucked her hands away, burying the calluses, the splinters, and the raw power out of sight. She hunched her broad shoulders inward, turning her face toward the shadows, waiting for the heavy, awkward silence that always followed her displays of power. She waited for him to look at her as a freak of nature. Thaddeus did not move away. Instead, he stepped closer. The absolute silence between them was not heavy with judgment, but thick with profound, unspoken reverence. He reached out, his massive, leather-gloved hands gently grasping her thick forearms. He did not ask her to uncross them. He applied a gentle, steady, utterly undeniable pressure, coaxing her to lower her defenses. Elowen swallowed hard, keeping her intense hazel eyes firmly fixed on the floorboards, unable to look at him as he gently drew her battered hands into the warm light of the hearth. Thaddeus removed his heavy leather gloves, tossing them onto the table. His own massive, deeply scarred hands cupped hers with staggering gentleness. He turned her palms upward. The firelight illuminated the brutal truth of her hands. They were entirely stripped of softness. They were a roadmap of survival, covered in heavy, yellowed calluses, deep, puckered burn scars from flying slag, and the fresh, bleeding cuts from the splintered ceiling beam. Thaddeus traced the edge of a deep old burn on her thumb. They kept a hot, extreme, agonizing care. His touch was so impossibly soft it drew a sudden involuntary shiver down her spine. He did not inspect her hands as if they were a deformity. He inspected them with the quiet, profound respect of a soldier, recognizing the medals of a comrade. He lifted his piercing gray eyes from her scarred palms, his gaze locking intensely onto hers. The stoic, unmoving mountain man looked at her with an emotion so unguarded, so deeply vulnerable. It made Elowen's heart slam wildly against her ribs. He lifted her battered, heavily muscled hand slightly, leaning in until the space between them vanished. The scent of his wood smoke and pine washing over her. A woman of delicate lace could not have saved my life today, he murmured, his deep voice carrying a husky, quiet tremor. He gently brushed his rough thumb over her knuckles. What fires forged a woman of such absolute iron? Elowen? The question hung in the quiet space between them, thick and resonant, cutting through the lingering dust of the near collapse. Elowen stared down at her ruined, bleeding hands, still held suspended in Thaddeus' gentle, massive grip. The heat of the roaring hearth fire washed over her broad face, but it was nothing compared to the terrifying, suffocating heat of the memories his words invoked. There is a profound, paralyzing terror in exposing the deepest roots of your shame. For years, Elowen had carried her past like an iron anvil upon her towering shoulders, convinced that to reveal it was to guarantee her own immediate banishment. She gently pulled her thick hands from his grasp. Thaddeus did not resist, allowing her the freedom to retreat. though he did not move a single inch away. He remained seated on the wooden stool, his broad chest rising and falling in a steady, calming rhythm, offering her the rarest gift of the untamed frontier: absolute, undivided patience. "Pennsylvania," she murmured, her voice a low, raspy tremor that tasted of old soot and buried grief. She turned her intense hazel eyes away from his stoic face, fixing her gaze entirely upon the dancing orange flames in the stove. "There is no sky there," she continued, the words slipping from her lips like slow-moving molten slag. "Only black smoke, raining gray ash, and the deafening eternal roar of the steel mills. My father was a puddler. He worked the massive furnaces, stirring boiling iron until his lungs turned to dust, and his back bowed under the weight of the company's greed." Thaddeus remained utterly silent, his piercing gray eyes locked onto the strong, angular profile of her face. He absorbed every heavy syllable, offering no interruption, no hollow pity. When the heat finally took him, he left behind a massive debt to the company store. Elowen breathed, her thick fingers nervously tracing the edge of her torn sleeve. "My uncle inherited the debt, but he had no intention of paying it with his own sweat. The mill bosses did not care who swung the sledgehammers, so long as the steel was forged and the quotas were met." She swallowed hard, her jaw tightening. Moat was 14. Moat took my father's place on the floor. The wind howled violently outside, a sharp, screaming contrast to the warm, agonizingly intimate silence within the cabin. "The heat of the forge melts away everything soft," Elowen whispered, her broad, heavily muscled shoulders dropping slightly as the oppressive weight of her confession settled over her. The iron demanded heavy lifting. The colossal gears and the massive sledgehammers demanded thick, unbreakable shoulders. "Day after day, year after year, the mill took my youth, and in return, it gave me this." She gestured down at her own towering, wildly muscular frame. A bitter, heartbreaking sorrow tightening the corners of her mouth. Moat grew into a giant to survive the fire. Moat watched the other women in the town walk past the mill in their delicate lace, their hands soft, their statures petite and graceful. Moat watched the men look at them with admiration and tenderness. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single, treacherous tear escaping to trace a clean line through the wood dust on her cheek. And Moat watched those same men look at me with fear, with absolute disgust. Moat was a monstrous anomaly, a beast born of the forge. Thaddeus shifted his massive weight on the stool, the heavy wood creaking softly. But he did not speak. My uncle decided Moat was an embarrassment, a hulking creature that could not be married off to any local man. She continued, her voice breaking slightly. So he looked west. He found a lonely timberman living high in the mountains. He penned letters filled with sweet, delicate lies, describing a fragile flower of a housewife, knowing full well no sane man would ever send for a woman built like a blacksmith. Elowen slowly turned her head, finally forcing herself to meet Thaddeus's gaze. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. This was the precipice. This was the moment. The illusion was permanently shattered. The moment the stoic mountain man would realize the extent of his ruinous investment. "Moat came here because I wanted to disappear," she confessed, her voice dropping to a desperate, ragged whisper. "Moat wanted to find a place where the sky was blue and the air did not burn my throat. But Moat knew it was a lie. Moat knew the moment you saw me, you would see the beast they all saw." She crossed her thick arms tightly over her chest, fully bracing for the inevitable command to leave. She waited for the anger. She waited for him to demand his money back, to curse her uncle's name, to point a massive finger toward the freezing, impenetrable blizzard outside. The silence stretched, long and deep. Thaddeus slowly stood up. His towering frame blocked the light of the hearth, casting a long, protective shadow over her trembling form. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable beneath his wild, dark beard. He turned his broad back to her and walked silently toward the heavy cedar chest at the foot of his cot. Elowen closed her eyes, her chest aching with a profound, hollow defeat. He is getting my coat, she thought miserably. He is going to send me out into the barn. The sound of a heavy latch clicking open reached her ears. A moment later, the soft, rhythmic tread of his leather boots approached her again. Elowen opened her eyes. Thaddeus stood before her, holding a massive, incredibly thick blanket spun of heavy gray wool. It was a blanket woven for a giant, large enough to envelop a massive man against the bitterest winter cold. With absolute, deliberate care, Thaddeus unfurled the heavy wool. He stepped behind her sturdy rocking chair. Reaching forward, he gently draped the massive blanket over Elowen's broad, deeply muscled shoulders. He did not pull it tight to hide her frame. He settled it comfortably, adjusting the heavy folds until it rested securely across her torn dress, radiating an immediate, profound warmth. He moved back around to the front of the chair, looking down at her battered, scarred hands, and then up into her terrified, tear-filled eyes. Lace tears in the mountain wind, Thaddeus rumbled, his deep, vibrating voice filling the quiet cabin with an absolute, unyielding certainty. Fragile things shatter when the winter falls. The men of the East who looked at you with fear were weak, blind fools who did not know the value of true iron. Elowen's breath hitched in her throat. Thaddeus reached out, his calloused, massive fingers gently brushing away the stray tear that rested on her high cheekbone. The touch was completely devoid of hesitation or pity. It was a touch of profound, staggering reverence. You did not break under the weight of the forge. Elowen, he murmured, using her name for the very first time, the sound of it rumbling beautifully in his deep chest. And you did not break under the weight of my roof. You are no beast. He stepped back, his piercing gray eyes softening with an emotion so deep and unspoken, it made the very air in the cabin feel charged with static heat. You are exactly the absolute strength this harsh mountain requires, he stated simply. You belong here. A massive, overwhelming wave of profound relief crashed violently over Elowen. The heavy, suffocating armor of shame she had worn for years fractured and crumbled into dust. She pulled the heavy wool blanket tighter around her broad shoulders, burying her face into the thick fabric as silent, healing sobs finally racked her colossal frame. For the first time in her entire grueling existence, she felt completely, undeniably safe. The storm raged on outside, battering the heavy timber walls of the cabin. But inside, a quiet, unbreakable sanctuary had been established. Thaddeus returned to his cot, leaving the lantern burning low to afford her peace. The unspoken promise of protection lingering heavily in the warm air. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing, pulsing embers. Elowen drifted into a deep, exhausted sleep within the rocking chair, anchored by the heavy weight of the wool blanket. Suddenly, the peaceful silence was shattered. Through the shrieking howl of the midnight blizzard, a faint, rhythmic sound drifted into the cabin. Thump. 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 Elowen's eyes snapped open. Thaddeus was already out of his cot, his massive frame moving silently across the floorboards, his heavy rifle firmly gripped in his hand. He paused near the door, turning his head to listen. The sound came again, weaker this time, dragging against the heavy wood of the door like a dying man's final plea. It was a desperate counterous, freezing pound, followed by a low, agonizing groan that the wind nearly swallowed whole. The cabin seemed to shrink, the air turning heavy with the sudden sharp tension of a trap being sprung. Thaddeus stood by the heavy oak door, his massive silhouette carved from shadow and resolve. He did not look at Elowen. His entire focus narrowed to the desperate, rhythmic pounding against the exterior wood. Thump. 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 It was not the sound of a predator. It lacked the vicious, calculated intent of the wolf pack. This was the clumsy, dying weight of a human being defeated by the insurmountable cruelty of the mountain. Thaddeus glanced back at Elowen. His expression was a silent question, an unspoken acknowledgement of the risks inherent in opening their sanctuary to a stranger during a blizzard that promised death to anything left exposed. Elowen nodded once, her movements fluid and decisive. She stood, the heavy wool blanket pooling around her waist, and moved to stand directly beside him. She did not feel the need to hide. She felt the need to protect. Thaddeus reached for the heavy iron crossbar. With a grunt of controlled power, he lifted it and pulled the door inward. The blizzard lunged into the cabin like a feral, white-fanged beast. Icy needles of snow stung their faces, and the temperature plummeted in a heartbeat. Through the swirling white chaos, a figure collapsed over the threshold, landing in a heap of frozen rags and rattling breath. They hauled the intruder inside together, their combined, colossal strength making the work effortless. Elowen grabbed the man under his arms, his body feeling tragically small and light compared to the giants he now occupied space with. Thaddeus slammed the door shut, locking out the gale, and together, they dragged the man toward the hearth. He was a prospector. Or so his weathered, frost-cracked clothing suggested. His face was a mask of gray, frozen skin, his lips turning a dangerous, waxy blue. He was barely conscious, his eyes flickering rapidly behind eyelids crusted with ice. "He's losing the battle," Thaddeus rumbled, his voice stripped of its usual calm. He grabbed a heavy bucket of snow from the porch to begin the dangerous work of rubbing life back into the man's frozen limbs. Elowen did not waste time with the snow. She knelt, her massive frame hovering over the shivering man like a gentle, protective shadow. She began to strip away his ice-stiffened coat, her hands moving with a practiced, terrifyingly steady grace. She remembered the nights in the steel mill when the men would collapse from heat stroke or crushing exhaustion. She had learned the art of resuscitation before she had learned to read properly. She knew how to distribute warmth, how to manage the shock, and how to hold a man together when his spirit was slipping away into the dark. Thaddeus watched, his rifle set aside, his gaze fixed on Elowen's hands. He had expected her to be clumsy, or perhaps fearful of the intrusion. Instead, he saw a transformation that defied his understanding. The giant woman who had hurled wolves and held up a collapsing roof was gone, replaced by a being of profound, infinite tenderness. Her touch was light, almost ethereal. As she chafed the man's stiffened wrists, she hummed again, that low, rhythmic, vibrating sound that had calmed the horses in the gorge. It was a sound that seemed to pull the very cold from the prospector's bones. She moved with a maternal, quiet authority, directing Thaddeus to bring warm broth, to stack more wood on the fire, to move the man closer to the heat, without exposing him to the direct, blistering burn of the flames. "Keep his head elevated," Elowen commanded softly, her intense hazel eyes locking onto Thaddeus's. Thaddeus obeyed without hesitation. He shifted his massive weight, cradling the prospector against his broad chest, providing a living, breathing heater of muscle and warmth. For the next 2 hours, the cabin became a sanctuary of focused, quiet labor. Elowen did not stop. She moved with a silent, tireless stamina that left Thaddeus breathless. She bathed the prospector's face, fed him tiny sips of heated liquid, and wrapped him in the layers of blankets she had retrieved from the back room. As the prospector's color finally began to return, a flush of returning blood spreading beneath his frost-bitten skin, he let out a long, ragged, wheezing sigh. His eyes cleared, focusing first on the ceiling beams, then on the massive, bearded face of Thaddeus, and finally, with a look of pure, bewildered shock, on the colossal, towering woman kneeling beside him. The man's mouth worked, his breath coming in shallow hitches. "Giants," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over stone. "And repair. Moth thought Mot D died and gone to the mountain spirits." Thaddeus offered him a cup of broth. "You in a cabin? Friend. Drink." The prospector drank, his gaze lingering on Elowen with a mixture of fear and profound awe. He seemed unable to reconcile the sheer scale of the woman with the gentle, maternal way she tucked a blanket around his shoulder. "You don't know what you've done," the man whispered, his eyes darting toward the heavy door, as if he expected a phantom to break through it. "You've brought them inside. If they see you two together," Thaddeus' brow furrowed, his hand resting instinctively on his rifle. Who is them? Man?" The prospector shivered. Even though the warmth of the cabin had finally reached him, Moot was coming down from the high pass 2 days ago, heard the rumors at the mining camp. There is a man hunting the trails, a bounty hunter, and he is looking for gold or silver. He's asking about a woman, a giant woman with iron in her blood. The cabin grew deadly silent. Elowen, who had been smoothing the blanket near the man's feet, froze. Her fingers curled into the wool, her knuckles turning white. "He's got a paper," the prospector continued, his voice dropping to a panicked, wheezing urgency. "Signed by a judge back east. Says she is a criminal. Says she stole a fortune in steel and left a trail of destruction behind her. He has been terrorizing the camps, breaking down doors, demanding to know if anyone has seen a woman who stands taller than a man." The prospector looked up at Elowen, his eyes wide, his own fear beginning to override his exhaustion. "He's coming this way." Moat saw his tracks near the valley floor. He has got 2 horses, a heavy load of supplies, and he does care if he leaves a graveyard in his wake. Elowen did not move. She remained frozen, her head bowed. The devastating weight of her past, the theft, the betrayal, the lies her uncle had spun, was no longer just a ghost. It was a physical force, riding the mountain trails, closing the distance to the cabin. She felt Thaddeus' gaze shift from the prospector to her. It was not a look of accusation, but it was heavy with the sudden, undeniable gravity of the situation. She had lied to him by omission. She had come to him claiming she wanted a new start, letting him believe her only burden was a cruel, manipulative uncle, and the shame of being a beast. She hadn't told him she was a fugitive, that she was worth money to men who lived for blood. She stood slowly, her massive frame casting a long, dark shadow across the floorboards. She felt the sudden, crushing urge to flee, to draw the danger away from this place, away from the man who had finally offered her a home. She turned to face the door, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You should have left me at the station," she whispered, her voice devoid of its earlier warmth, sounding now like the sharpening of a blade. "He won't stop until he finds what he's paid for." Thaddeus stood up, his towering form dwarfing the room. He walked toward her, his movements slow, deliberate, and undeniably heavy. "Elowen," he murmured, his voice a low, warning growl. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on the door, watching the blizzard lash against the glass, wondering if the shadow of the bounty hunter was already standing just beyond the threshold. What would he do when the law came knocking? Would he hand her over? Or would he stand against the entire world for a woman whose past was written in blood? The air in the cabin had turned sharp, brittle, and cold, mirroring the internal winter that now gripped Elowen's heart. The confession hung in the air like a death knell. She stood motionless, her broad, muscled shoulders squared against the impending storm. Not the one howling against the timber walls, but the one she had dragged into this mountain sanctuary on her own back. Thaddeus moved across the floorboards. His heavy, measured tread was the only sound in the room, save for the crackling of the dying fire. He stopped inches behind her, his massive presence a wall of heat and solidity. Elowen held her breath, waiting for the heavy hand of rejection. Or perhaps the cold realization that she was nothing more than a liability, a magnet for violence that threatened his life and his hard-won peace. "The steel," Thaddeus stated, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "Was it yours?" Elwyn turned slowly. The firelight played across his rugged, stoic features, searching for the disgust she felt she deserved. She didn't to flinch. She had spent a lifetime running from the truth. She was finished with the shadows. "It was never mine," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "The mills in Pennsylvania belonged to the workers. My uncle forged the ledgers. He stole the railroad shipments, sold them to black market smiths, and used my name for every transaction. He knew if the company came looking, they would find a giant, unruly woman with a history of defiance. They would find me before they found him." She paced toward the center of the room, her heavy boots thumping against the wood. "When the warrants arrived, mot dei no to wait. Mot ka no ave kep, no one would believe a woman like me against a man like him. So Mort ran. Mott came here because I thought Mott could disappear in the vastness of the West." She stopped, turning to face him fully, her intense hazel eyes searching his. "You didn't bargain for a fugitive, Thaddeus. You didn't bargain for a woman with a price on her head. That man in the snow, the bounty hunter, he isn't coming for justice. He is coming to finish a contract." Elwyn walked toward the door, her hand hovering over the iron latch. "I want to stay and drag this violence onto your doorstep. You've given me more in a week than Matev had in a lifetime. Mot luglunt go before he arrives." Her fingers tightened on the freezing metal, but she never made the motion to lift it. A massive, calloused hand clamped over her wrist, stopping her mid-motion. Thaddeus didn't pull her back. He simply held her there, his grip immovable, a tether to the earth. The strength of his hold was staggering, yet there wasn't a hint of aggression in it. It was a declaration. "You aren't going anywhere," he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that made the very air seem to vibrate. He pulled her hand away from the latch, his movements firm and entirely final. "Mode ande no to choose this life because Mott wanted a quiet, simple existence," he continued, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that burned. "Moot chose it because the mountain is honest. It does care about ledgers, or judges, or the games of men in the East. Here, a man's word is his life." He stepped into her personal space, his towering frame casting her in his shadow. "You are not a liability, Elwyn. You are my wife. The papers might not be filed in some distant office, but in this house, before this hearth, the commitment is made." Elwyn felt the breath hitch in her chest. "But he is coming. He is a killer, Thaddeus. He has resources. He has a gun and no mercy." Thaddeus released her wrist and stepped back, his posture shifting into the stance of a man preparing for war. He walked to the corner of the cabin, where a loose floorboard sat beneath a heavy wooden crate. He pried it up, revealing a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay a heavy-duty, long-barreled revolver and a belt of ammunition. "Let him come," Thaddeus replied, his voice devoid of fear. "He will find that the mountain doesn't take kindly to intruders who bring their poison into its air." The shift in the room was absolute. The dynamic between them had fundamentally broken and reformed. They were no longer a lonely man and a mysterious woman sharing a cabin. They were a united front, two giants standing against the encroachment of a corrupt world. The paradigm of their relationship, from master and bride, to protector and protected, to something far deeper and more volatile, had finally reached its fulcrum. Elwyn looked at the rifle on the table, then back to the man who was willing to lose everything to keep her safe. A new, terrifying emotion bloomed in her chest. not the fear of the hunter, but the fear of losing the one person who had truly seen her, not as a beast, but as an equal. "Why?" she whispered, the word barely audible. "Why throw away your life for me?" Thaddeus paused, his hand hovering over the revolver. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, the stoic mask slipped. His gray eyes softened, revealing a depth of loneliness and longing that matched the silence he had lived in for years. "Mote have spent my life cutting down trees, shaping them, and watching them stand," he said softly. "But this cabin has always been empty. It was just a place to wait for the end. You didn't just walk through that door, Elowen. You brought the light back. I would rather face 100 bounty hunters than go back to the silence of that life." He walked toward her, his movements stripped of all restraint. He stopped inches away, his massive, calloused hands coming up to cradle her face. His touch was warm, grounding, and incredibly intimate. The smell of pine, leather, and wood smoke surrounded her, becoming the scent of home. Elowen trembled, not from cold, but from the raw, sudden surge of affection that threatened to overwhelm her. She reached up, her own massive, scarred hands cupping his cheeks, feeling the rough stubble of his beard, the heat of his skin, and the strength of the jawline that had never once faltered. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was heavy, pulsing with the life they had forged in the face of death. Outside, the wind shifted. A new sound pierced the night, the distinct, metallic clink of a horseshoe hitting a rock, followed by the low, impatient snort of a horse. Thaddeus's head snapped toward the door. His eyes hardened, the softness vanishing as instantly as it had appeared. He pulled away, reaching for his coat and checking the load in the revolver. "He's here," Thaddeus muttered, his voice cold and sharp. Elowen moved to the hearth, her gaze falling upon the heavy, iron-headed maul she had used earlier to split the hemlock stump. She picked it up, feeling the familiar, grounding weight of the handle in her palm. The panic of the past hour had evaporated, replaced by a cold, predatory clarity. She was not the prey. She was the mountain. Thaddeus walked to the door, his hand resting on the iron bar. He looked back at her one last time, a look of profound, silent communication. It was an acknowledgement of the choice they had made. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice low and firm. "No," Elowen replied, stepping forward until she stood directly beside him, the heavy iron maul resting against her thigh. She met his gaze, her jaw set, her hazel eyes blazing with a defiant, beautiful light. "We stand together." The heavy, rhythmic crunch of footsteps on the frozen snow stopped directly outside the door. A gloved fist struck the oak, 3 sharp, arrogant knocks that vibrated through the floorboards. "Open up," a voice bellowed from the darkness. A rough, grating sound that lacked any trace of humanity. "Mut know you in there. Logger. Hand over the giant, or you'll be digging 2 graves before sunrise." Thaddeus tightened his grip on the rifle, his eyes never leaving the door. Elowen took a half-step forward, the iron maul ready in her hands. The bounty hunter was on the other side of the wood, and the final test of their resolve had begun. The bounty hunter's voice was like grinding glass, harsh and impatient against the muffled roar of the wind. It was the voice of a man who viewed the world as a transaction, a man who saw no value in human life that couldn't be quantified in silver. Thaddeus stood immovable, a monolith of silent, lethal intent. He didn't answer. He didn't issue a threat. He merely slid the heavy iron bar aside, his movements smooth and economical. The door swung inward, and the frigid air swirled into the cabin, carrying the metallic scent of wet horsehair and cold gun oil. A man stood on the threshold. He was lean, wire-thin, and sharp-featured, wrapped in a long, dark duster that billowed violently in the gale. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room, flickering past Thaddeus and locking onto Elowen with a predatory, gloating hunger. He didn't see a woman, he saw a bounty. There you are, the man sneered, his hand hovering over the pistol strapped to his hip. Mott V tracked that frame across 3 states. You re a long way from the mills. Girl. And you, he spat, glancing at Thaddeus. Must be the fool who thinks he can keep what is wanted by the law. Thaddeus stepped forward, his massive frame effectively blocking the man's line of sight to Elowen. He didn't raise his rifle, but the way his muscles corded beneath his flannel shirt warned of an imminent, violent response. There is no law here, stranger, only this mountain, and you re-trespassing. The bounty hunter's hand twitched toward his holster, his eyes narrowing. Mott V got papers. Federal warrants. You re-harboring a fugitive who stole thousands in railroad property. Step aside, logger, or you'll be the first body Mott bury. Elowen stepped out from behind Thaddeus' shoulder. She didn't look like a woman fearing for her life. She looked like a force of nature. She held the iron maul with a casual, terrifying ease, the head of it resting near her feet, the handle gripped in her massive, calloused hand. The steel was stolen by the man who signed those papers, Elowen said, her voice cutting through the wind, cold and resonant. Mott de no to take a coin, and Mott didn't he take a rivet. You re-hunting a ghost made of lies. The hunter laughed, a dry, hacking sound. Mott don't care about the truth. Lady. Mott care about the reward. And the man who paid me does to care if you re-innocent. So long as you re-delivered, he made his move. It was fast, fueled by years of mercenary violence. His hand whipped toward his gun, his fingers curling around the grip in a blur of practice. But he had miscalculated the speed of a giant. Thaddeus didn't he pull his rifle. He closed the distance with a terrifying, liquid gray spacenter, his hand sweeping out to clamp onto the hunter's wrist before the man could draw his weapon. The impact sounded like a strike against a tombstone. The hunter gasped, his face contorting in pain as Thaddeus applied pressure. Thaddeus didn't fight the man's strength, he annihilated it. He twisted, a sharp, controlled motion that sent the hunter stumbling forward, off balance and desperate. Elowen was already in motion. She didn't strike the man. She moved with a calculated, intimidating efficiency. She stepped between them, her towering height looming over the hunter, and brought the handle of the maul down with a precise strike that knocked the gun from his grip. It skittered across the floorboards, coming to rest near the hearth. The hunter scrambled back, his eyes wild, realizing he was trapped between 2 beings who were physically superior to him in every conceivable way. He reached for a secondary weapon, a curved knife hidden in his boot, but Elowen was faster. She grabbed him by the back of his duster, lifted him effortlessly as if he were a sack of feed, and dumped him backward onto the snow-covered porch. He landed hard, the cold air knocking the wind from his lungs. Thaddeus stepped out into the blizzard, his rifle now raised, leveled directly at the man's chest. You have 5 minutes to reach your horses and clear this trail, Thaddeus said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that held no room for negotiation. If Mott see you again, I want aim for your holster. The bounty hunter looked up, his face pale, his bravado shattered by the raw, physical dominance he had just witnessed. He recognized the look in Thaddeus' eyes, the look of a man who would kill without hesitation to protect his home. He scrambled to his feet, fumbling for his hat, and retreated into the darkness toward his mounts. They watched until the shadows of the horses disappeared into the white curtain of the storm. Then, and only then, did Thaddeus take Rona back to Elowen. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his gray eyes searching hers. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence. Elowen leaned the maul against the doorframe, her heart finally slowing its frantic pace. She looked at Thaddeus, seeing the tension, the unspoken fear of what had almost happened, the fear that he might have lost her. "He'll go to the sheriff in the valley," Elowen said quietly, her eyes cast downward. "He'll tell them you assaulted a federal officer. He'll come back with a posse." Thaddeus walked to her, reaching out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was trembling, a subtle, human vulnerability that revealed how close he had truly come to losing his composure. "Then we will deal with the posse when they arrive," he replied, his voice firm. "But tonight, we are still here." He moved to pull her closer, intending to wrap his arms around her. But he stumbled, his face drained of color, and he gripped the doorframe for support, his knees buckling slightly. Elowen lunged, catching him by the shoulders. As Thaddeus, she looked down at his side. Beneath his flannel shirt, the fabric was soaked in a deep, dark crimson. Her heart stopped. She had been so focused on the hunter, so focused on the threat in front of them, that she hadn't noticed the grazing bullet that had ripped through his side during the brief, violent struggle. "You were hit," she whispered, her hands frantically pressing against the wound, her mind racing with the horrific, familiar geometry of trauma. Thaddeus looked down at his side, then back up at her, a weak, strained smile tugging at his mouth. "It says nothing. Just a scratch." But he was wrong. The cold of the mountain was already seeping into the wound, and the pallor of his skin spoke of a deeper, more dangerous injury. "Get inside," Elowen commanded, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute, unbreakable resolve. She hauled his massive weight over her shoulders, his arm draped across her back. She didn't feel the strain of his size. She only felt the terrifying, pulsing heat of his blood against her own clothes. She carried him into the cabin, past the empty hearth, and laid him gently onto his cot. She worked with a feverish, focused intensity. She needed water. She needed clean linen. She needed to staunch the flow before the infection of the mountain cold set in. But as she moved to the wash basin, Thaddeus reached out, his hand grasping hers. His grip was weak, lacking its usual iron firmness, and his eyes were beginning to flutter. "Elowen," he murmured, his voice sounding distant, like a man speaking from the bottom of a well. Don't be afraid. The mountain, it has a way of balancing the books." "Hush," she snapped, her eyes stinging. "You aren't going anywhere. Do you hear me? We are just beginning." She turned away to fetch the supplies. But when she returned, she found him staring at the ceiling, his eyes glazed, his body shaking with the sudden, violent onset of a fever. The realization hit her with the force of a hammer. The wound was deeper than she had thought, and the mountain air was already claiming him. She was alone. She was a fugitive, and the man who had given her everything was slipping away in front of her eyes. She sank to her knees beside the cot, gripping his massive, fevered hand in hers. She felt the raw, terrifying edge of the precipice. If she lost him, She lost the only world she had ever known. Thaddeus. Stay with me, she pleaded, her voice cracking for the first time. But he didn't answer. He just drifted, his breath becoming shallow and erratic as the fever took hold, dragging him into the dark depths of a past he had never dared to name. As she leaned over him, her own strength felt like a hollow shell. She had fought the wolves. She had held up the roof. And she had stood down a killer, but she had no idea how to fight the silence that was waiting to take him. The cabin had transformed into a tomb of suffocating heat and frantic, labored breathing. The fever was a living, breathing entity, claiming the giant timberman as its own. Thaddeus, a man who had weathered decades of mountain winters, was now shivering violently, his massive frame tossing against the thin mattress of his cot. His skin, usually the bronze of a man who lived in the sun and rain, was pale and damp with a cold, sickly sweat. Elowen did not sleep. She did not eat. Her world had narrowed down to the rhythmic rattling rise and fall of Thaddeus' chest. She had become his caretaker, his guardian, and his sole tether to the living world. The irony was a jagged blade in her heart. She, the woman who had lived her entire life feeling like a burden, was now the only thing standing between the strongest man she had ever known and the grave. She took over the rhythm of his life. She kept the fire roaring, the light in the cabin constant. She carried the heavy water buckets from the frozen stream, her own muscles screaming from the exertion of splitting logs, hauling supplies, and physically turning his massive body to prevent the congestion in his lungs from settling into a fatal rot. Every time she touched him, to wipe his brow with a cool, damp cloth, to adjust his bandages, to pour tiny life-sustaining sips of water into his cracked lips. She felt the terrifying fragility of his situation. He was so big, so undeniably powerful, yet here he was, reduced to a hollow, suffering shell by a single, jagged piece of lead. On the third night, the fever broke into a delirium. Thaddeus began to talk. It was the rambling of a confused mind, but the fragmented, painful echoes of a history he had buried deep beneath his stoic exterior. Too slow, he rasped, his eyes squeezed shut, his head thrashing against the pillow. The ice. The timber gave way. Moat should have heard the crack. Moat should have braced. Elowen knelt beside him, her heart breaking as she listened. She reached out, her large, calloused hands cradling his head, applying a firm, grounding pressure to his temples. It was too your fault. Thaddeus. You are here. You are safe. They didn't make it, he whispered, his voice thick with a grief that spanned years. The crew. They trusted me to guide them through the pass. Mot they know to see the slide. Mort let them walk right into the belly of the mountain. The truth hit Elowen with staggering force. Thaddeus hadn't just chosen to live in isolation because he was a solitary man by nature. He had chosen it because he was a man living in self-imposed exile, carrying the crushing, unbearable weight of a tragedy he believed he could never outrun. He had tried to protect her, not just because of some abstract chivalry, but because he was a man who had failed to protect those who had relied on him once before. The terror of her being hunted, of her being endangered, had triggered a trauma that went deeper than any physical wound. You couldn't have stopped the mountain, Elowen murmured, her voice steady, pouring every ounce of her strength into the words. You are not a god, Thaddeus. You are a man. And you have survived, so you can choose better. She felt him go still under her hands. His breathing evened out, the jagged edges of his delirium softening. The next morning, the fever finally broke. The harsh, unnatural heat of his skin faded into a cool, natural warmth. Thaddeus let out a long, shuddering breath, his eyelashes fluttering. When he finally opened his eyes, they were clear. They lacked the fog of the fever, but they were filled with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He looked up at Elowen, who sat hunched over the cot, her hair tangled. Now, her eyes rimmed dark circles, looking as if she had aged a decade in the span of 3 days. He tried to sit up, but his body betrayed him. He collapsed back against the mattress with a groan, his face tightening in pain. Elowen was there, instantly, her hand on his chest, gently but firmly holding him down. Don't move. You've lost a great deal of blood, and the infection nearly took you. You are staying right there. Thaddeus looked at her, his gaze lingering on the dark patches of blood on her sleeves, his blood, and the way she had clearly neglected her own needs to ensure his survival. You stayed, he whispered, his voice raspy. Where else would Mot go? Elowen replied, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. You told me Mot belonged here. Thaddeus reached out, his hand wrapping around hers. Even in his weakened state, his grip was an anchor. Mot was a fool. Mot told you to stay behind me. Mot day note to mean for you to carry the entire weight of this place alone. It's not a weight, Elowen said, her eyes watering. For the first time in my life, it's a choice. The intimacy of the moment was thick, almost suffocating. Elowen felt the walls between them, the walls built of trauma, of survival, of the masks they wore to face the world, dissolving. She saw him not as the giant mountain man, but as a man who had lost his way and was only now beginning to see the path back. He squeezed her hand. The bounty hunter. Gone, Elowen lied, though she knew he would return. She had seen the tracks circling the cabin every morning. The persistent, haunting reminder that their peace was bought on borrowed time. He knows this mountain is not a place for cowards. He won be back. Thaddeus didn't argue. He leaned his hat a day back, his eyes closing. But he didn't let go of her hand. Over the next few days, the cabin became a place of slow, deliberate healing. Elowen took on the duties of the homestead with a quiet, efficient strength that Thaddeus watched with a mixture of disbelief and growing, tender adoration. He watched her chop the wood, her massive shoulders moving with a fluid, rhythmic power that was beautiful to behold. He watched her mend his shirt's hot hands that were made for iron, her patience as infinite as the mountain range itself. He was beginning to realize that everything he thought he knew about strength was wrong. He had thought strength was the ability to hold up a roof or to endure the cold. Now he saw that true strength was what Elowen possessed, the ability to hold on to hope when the world had given her every reason to let it go. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting the cabin in a long, golden glow, Thaddeus managed to sit up against the headboard of his cot. Elowen brought him a bowl of broth, her movements gentle and focused. As he finished, he caught her hand, pulling her to sit on the edge of the cot beside him. He looked at her, his gaze searching, intense, and finally, undeniably open. Mot have spent years building walls of stone and pine, he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual gruffness. Mot thought Mot was keeping the world out. Mot was only keeping myself in. Elowen didn't pull away. She sat, feeling the heat of his presence, the weight of the man who had changed the entire trajectory of her life. Why now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why let the walls down now? Thaddeus reached out, his hand coming to rest on her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, his touch light, reverent, and full of a longing that made her heart ache. Because for the first time, he murmured, Mot have something worth protecting that is made of wood or iron. Elowen felt the air leave her lungs. That, the confession, though simple, felt like a seismic shift in the foundation of their lives. She leaned forward, the distance between them closing until their foreheads rested against one another. The silence that followed was not the heavy, awkward silence of their first night. It was a silence of discovery, of two people who had wandered through the dark, cold corners of the world, only to find that their true purpose had been waiting in each other all along. But as the gold of the sunset faded into the encroaching blue of night, the silence was abruptly broken. Outside, a single, sharp sound echoed through the valley, the unmistakable, hollow crack of a rifle shot. It was the sound of hunting. It was the sound of someone signaling their arrival. Thaddeus' eyes snapped open. He knew that sound. It was the hunter. And he was alone. From the ridge above the cabin, the answering light of a dozen campfires flickered to life, ringing their home like a tightening noose. The flickering lights on the ridge were not stars. They were the cold, uncaring eyes of an encroaching pack. A dozen or more fires burned in the darkness, encircling the cabin in a jagged ring of orange flame. The bounty hunter had not returned alone. He had returned with a small army of desperate, cold-hardened men. Men who smelled coin and blood in equal measure. Men who had no qualms about burning a cabin to the ground to claim what they believed was theirs. Thaddeus lurched out of the cot, his jaw locked in a grimace of agony as the movement tore at his healing side. He stumbled, his massive frame swaying like a felled tree, his hand fumbling for the rifle leaning against the wall. Elowen was there before he could regain his balance. She caught him by the shoulders, her grip firm and unyielding. She did not coddle him. She anchored him. She felt the frantic, irregular heat radiating from his skin. The fever was gone, but the weakness remained, a lingering reminder of how close death had walked with him. "Sit," she commanded, the word devoid of doubt. Thaddeus shook his head, his eyes burning with a dark, stubborn fire. "Lord cannot let them surround us, Elowen. If they start a fire, if they force the door, if you walk out that door in your current state, you are merely a target," she countered, guiding him firmly back toward the cot. "The mountain is our ally tonight. Look at the perimeter. They are set up on the high ground. Yes, but they are inexperienced. They don't know the terrain. They don't know the drifts." She pressed him down until he was seated. He was panting, his face pale, his hands trembling. A reality that ate at him with a bitterness more potent than his physical pain. He was a giant, a man who had spent his life dominating the landscape, and now he was tethered to a cot by a single, jagged bullet wound. The embarrassment was a physical weight, heavier than any timber he had ever shouldered. He hated the vulnerability. He hated that she had to do everything. The cooking, the wood hauling, the watching, the guarding. It felt to him like a betrayal of the life he had built, a violation of the order he had maintained for years. Elowen saw the shame in the tightening of his eyes, in the way he clenched his fists against his thighs. She knew that look. She had worn it for most of her life. She turned away, moving to the heavy basin of water she had warmed by the fire. She retrieved a straight razor, a whetstone, and a clean length of cloth. She did not ask for permission. She moved to the cot, setting the basin on a stool, and then she did something that shattered the heavy, defensive air of the room. She knelt between his knees. Thaddeus stiffened, his breath hitching. "Elowen, what are you doing?" She didn't answer with words. She dipped the cloth into the warm water, wringing it out with hands that moved with a sudden, startling gentleness. She reached up, her large, calloused palms cupping his face. The skin of his cheeks was rough with weeks of wild, neglected growth, a thick, graying beard that hid the hard lines of his jaw, and the exhaustion etched into his features. He tried to pull back, his pride flaring. But her touch was a command he could not disobey. She began to wash him. The motion was slow, methodical, and deeply intimate. She cleared away the grime of the fever, the dust of the mountain, the accumulated grit of his long, lonely isolation. As she worked, she applied the warm soap, her fingers moving in wide, soothing circles over his skin. He stared down at her, mesmerized. The woman who had fought off a pack of wolves and held up a roof was now, with infinite tenderness, shaving the face of the man who had lost his own sense of self. The proximity was agonizing. She was so close he could smell the scent of wood smoke and dried lavender that clung to her hair. He could see the intensity in her hazel eyes, not the intense, predatory focus of the hunt, but an intensity of quiet, profound devotion. She took the razor, the cold steel gleaming in the firelight. She moved with the precision of a master smith, the blade gliding over his skin. She followed the line of his jaw, the curve of his throat, her touch light as a feather. Thaddeus went completely still. He stopped trying to look at the windows, stopped trying to listen to the sounds of the men on the ridge. He was entirely, utterly centered on her. Every stroke of the razor brought them closer. When she leaned in to clear the hair around his lips, the air between them grew thick, charged with a magnetism that made his pulse hammer against his ribs. The vulnerability he had been fighting, the embarrassment of his weakness, suddenly transformed into something else. It was no longer about being helpless. It was about being cared for. It was a surrender he hadn't known he needed. Elowen finished, wiping his face clean with the warm cloth. She set the razor aside and traced the line of his jaw with her thumb, her eyes searching his. She saw the change in him. The tension had bled out of his frame, replaced by a quiet, raw openness that she had never dared hope to see. "You are not broken," she whispered, her voice a soft, velvet vibration. "You are only healing. And you do not have to do it alone." Thaddeus reached up, his hand coming to rest over hers. He turned his head, pressing his cheek against her palm. The gesture was so simple, so undeniably tender, that it felt like a vow. The cabin seemed to contract, the rest of the world fading into a distant, inconsequential hum. The threats outside, the bounty hunter, the winter, the suds, the past, it all vanished. There was only the fire, the silence, and the profound, physical awareness of each other. His hand slid from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the thick, braided weight of her hair. He pulled her forward just an inch, a subtle, tentative movement. Elowen didn't resist. She leaned into him, their foreheads resting together. The air was filled with their shared breath, the rhythm of their hearts sinking in the quiet. He felt the broad, formidable strength of her shoulders beneath his palms, and he realized with a sudden overwhelming clarity that he didn't want to be the protector anymore. He wanted to be a partner. He wanted to share the weight. "They are coming for you," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he could barely name. "Mort would burn this mountain to the ground before Mort. Let them touch you." "Ka na ovekep," Elowen replied, closing her eyes. "But we aren't going to let them win." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her into the warmth of the cot. She didn't hesitate. She climbed up, her frame folding into his, the massive scale of them filling the bed, their limbs tangling in a desperate, grounding embrace. They lay there for a long time, the only movement the slow, steady rise and fall of their joined bodies. It was a moment of grace, a fleeting sanctuary carved out of the chaos. But the mountain had no mercy for sentiment. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy, the humidity spiking with an unnatural intensity. A low, vibrating boom, like the shifting of the earth itself, shuddered through the floorboards. Thaddeus' eyes snapped open. He knew that sound. It was the sound of the world tearing itself apart. He sat up, ignoring the sharp, stabbing protest of his side. He grabbed his coat, his eyes searching the dark space of the cabin. "What is it?" Elowin asked, scrambling up beside him. He went to the window, scraping away a patch of frost. Outside, the world was moving. The night was no longer silent. A roar, growing in volume by the second, began to rise from the gorge below. The spring thaw had come. It hadn't arrived in a slow, gentle trickle of melting snow. It had come in a catastrophic, sudden wall of water. The deep, frozen winter accumulation had reached its limit, and the entire mountain above them was weeping. The ice in the canyon had shattered. A flash flood, a violent, muddy torrent of water and debris, was carving its way up the mountain path, the only path that connected them to the lower valley. The only path the bounty hunter could use to retreat, and the only path that might have offered an escape. But, as they watched, the ground beneath the cabin shuddered. The bridge, the vital, rotting timber structure that spanned the gorge, groaned under the sudden, colossal weight of the churning water. A final, sickening crunch echoed through the valley. The bridge snapped like a twig, disappearing instantly into the black, frothing maw of the river. They were trapped. And from the sounds rising from the ridge, the bounty hunters had seen it, too. They were moving, abandoning their camps, rushing toward the gorge, only to find that their path to the world below was gone. The roar of the gorge was no longer a sound. It was a physical weight, a thunderous vibration that rattled the very foundation of the mountain. The flash flood had transformed the narrow, rocky creek into a churning, frothing maw of dark water, ice, and splintered timber. The bridge, which had served as the only vein of commerce and escape for the high timber camp, was gone, reduced to nothing more than driftwood. Being pummeled against the canyon walls downstream, Thaddeus stood on the edge of the abyss, his hand pressed against the fresh, jagged bandages on his side. He watched the water, a violent, opaque brown, and felt the cold dread of a man who knew exactly what the mountain was capable of. The bounty hunters were stranded on the ridge across the chasm, their campfires now flickering like distant, impotent stars. They were trapped by the same river that had severed the cabin from the world. For the moment, the law and the bullets were locked on the other side. But the cabin was dangerously close to the bank, and with the river rising, the structural integrity of the entire plateau was in question. They needed a crossing, not to flee, but to reach the high, solid ground of the upper ridge, the only place safe from the inevitable mudslides that would follow such a violent thaw. Elowin approached him, her movements silent, her gaze locked on the torrent. She did not need to speak to understand the gravity of the situation. Her massive, capable hands were already occupied with a coil of heavy hemp rope, and a massive, iron-headed maul rested on her shoulder. "The shelf above the falls," Thaddeus rumbled, his voice barely audible over the thundering water. "It's the only place the gorge narrows enough to bridge. If we can fell a pine long enough to span it, we can move the supplies and make for higher ground." Elowin nodded, her eyes flashing with a cold, focused determination. "Then we move." They trekked through the slushy, melting snow, the landscape shifting and groaning under their feet. The bounty hunters across the way had stopped their shouting, their figures visible through the twilight, huddled around their own desperate fires. They were watching, waiting to see what the giants would do. They were predators, but they were paralyzed by the same nature that Elowin and Thaddeus were fighting to master. When they reached the narrowest point of the gorge, the chasm was still terrifyingly wide. Below, the water surged with enough power to uproot boulders. Elowin dropped the rope. She assessed the towering white pines that lined the bank. They were ancient, massive things, scarred by wind and time. She chose one that slanted toward the gap, a natural lever waiting for the right force. "This one," she stated, her voice steady. Thaddeus stepped in, his face tight with the effort of masking his pain. "Mort will notch the cut. You swing." Elowen did to argue. She stepped up to the tree, her broad, muscled shoulders shifting beneath her wool layers. She began to swing the maul, the iron head striking the wood with a rhythmic, thunderous cadence. Thaddeus, his movements favoring his injured side, used his axe to guide the felling direction, his eyes sharp, calculating the angles. They worked in a trance. The exhaustion that should have leveled them was burned away by the necessity of the moment. They were a singular machine, the logger and the forge born. Two giants bending the mountain to their will. The tree began to groan. A deep, crystalline crack echoed through the gorge, competing with the roar of the river. "Back," Thaddeus commanded, grabbing Elowen's arm and pulling her away just as the giant pine shuddered and plummeted. It struck the opposite bank with a jarring impact, the wood screaming as it settled. A rough and precarious log bridge spanning the churning chaos below. It was unstable. It was slick with melting ice. But it was there. Thaddeus moved first, testing the timber with his weight. Jip. The log swayed, bowing under his mass. He reached the other side, his boots slipping on the mud. But he caught himself, his hands finding purchase in the rough bark. He turned back, extending his hand across the gap. Elowen stepped onto the log. She moved with the grace of a mountain goat, her balance absolute. But the wind, caught in the funnel of the gorge, swirled violently. A sudden, frigid blast that hit her broadside. She swayed. Her foot caught on a patch of slick, wet moss. She didn't scream. She didn't flail. She simply tilted, her center of gravity shifting, and she plunged off the side of the log. Elowen. Thaddeus' shout was a raw, primal sound that ripped through the valley. He didn't think. He didn't calculate the risk to his own body. He launched himself from the opposite bank, his hands clawing at the air, his entire colossal frame diving toward the spot where she had vanished. She hit the freezing, violent water with a sickening splash. The river, a monster of ice and debris, instantly tried to drag her under, the current pulling at her limbs with the strength of 100 men. She kicked, fighting to surface, her lungs burning. The cold was a physical blow, a paralytic shock that stole the breath from her chest. A shadow loomed over her. Thaddeus. He had gone into the water feet first, his weight breaking the surface tension. He surfaced a few yards downstream, his eyes wild, searching the roiling foam. He saw her, a flash of dark wool against the brown water. He didn't swim, he lunged, his massive hands reaching out, fingers hooking into the shoulder of her dress. The current slammed them both into a submerged rock. The impact sent a jolt of pure, white-hot agony through Thaddeus' wounded side, but he refused to let go. He wrapped his arms around her waist, locking her against his broad, iron-hard chest. Using his colossal strength, he fought the river. He dug his boots into the slick, shifting silt of the riverbed, his muscles bulging, his veins standing out against his neck. He became an immovable object in the path of an irresistible force. Slowly, agonizingly, he waded toward the bank, his feet sliding on the treacherous rocks. Elowen clung to him, her face buried against his soaked flannel, her hands gripping the back of his coat. She could feel the shudders racking his frame, the sheer, unsustainable effort of holding them both against the torrent. He lunged for the bank, his fingers digging into the frozen mud. With a final, desperate heave, He hauled them both out of the water, collapsing onto the snowy, pine-covered ground. They lay there in a tangled heap, gasping, their clothes heavy and freezing, the icy spray of the river coating them in a layer of frost. For a long time, the only sound was the thundering river, now just a few feet away, and the ragged, desperate sound of their breathing. Elowen pushed herself up, her hands trembling as she touched Thaddeus's face. He was shivering violently, his eyes fixed on the sky, his chest heaving. You should have, she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. The current. You could have died. Thaddeus turned his head, his gray eyes searching hers, filled with a raw, terrifying honesty that bypassed every defense she had ever built. He pulled her into his arms, his grip so tight it bordered on painful, burying his face in the crook of her neck. But do not know how to be in a world where you are not, he breathed, his voice a ragged, desperate admission that tore through the remaining walls of his heart. Elowen felt the tears mingle with the river water on her cheeks, the terrifying fragility of their lives, the bounty hunters on the ridge, the cold, the hunger. It all receded. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was the steady, thumping heartbeat of the man against her own. She was no longer a fugitive, no longer a beast of the forge, no longer a mail-order secret. She was a woman anchored in the arms of a man who would defy the very mountains to keep her. She pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the heat of him, the strength that had saved her. She reached up, her fingers brushing against her throat, moving to touch the iron pendant her father had forged, the symbol of her family, the piece of home she had carried across the country. Her hand froze, her fingers closed on empty air. The pendant was gone. The heavy, blackened iron chain had snapped during the struggle in the rapids. It was tea there. She sat up, her eyes wide, scanning the snowy bank, the dark, churning water, the shadows of the gorge. A cold, hollow ache, sharper than the freezing river, blossomed in her chest. It was the only tangible link to the life she had left behind. The only proof of the girl she had once been before the forge had consumed her. She looked toward the river, the dark water continuing its relentless, indifferent path, swallowing everything it touched. It's gone, she whispered, her voice hollow. Everything. It's all gone. The return to the cabin was a blur of shivering limbs and the pervasive, biting ache of frozen marrow. They moved as one, a singular organism of shared survival collapsing onto the rug before the hearth. The heat from the fire, usually a source of comfort, now stung their raw, numbed skin, a prickling reminder of the life returning to their veins. Elowen sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her hair plastered to her skull, dripping onto the floorboards. She felt a profound, hollow emptiness in her chest that had nothing to do with the freezing water. Her hand kept straying to her throat, fingers curling into nothing but the rough wool of her dress. The iron pendant, the simple blackened piece of metal her father had hammered into existence, the only tangible remnant of the life she had been forced to abandon, was at the bottom of the churning, indifferent gorge. She felt like a ghost, untethered from her history. She had come west to find a new beginning, but without that pendant, she felt as if the bridge to her past had been burned, leaving her drifting in a world where she didn't quite know who she was supposed to be. Thaddeus sat across the hearth, his own frame trembling with the residual effects of the cold. He was battered, his shirt torn open, his side weeping fresh blood where the river's violence had reopened his wound. Yet his piercing gray eyes were fixed on her, observing every subtle twitch, every shadow that crossed her face. He didn't speak. He didn't offer hollow platitudes about how things could be replaced. He understood the language of loss better than any man she had ever met. He watched the way her hand drifted to her throat, again and again, a silent, unconscious prayer for a lost memory. He knew exactly what had been taken by the river. He rose, his movements stiff and pained, and retreated to the shadows of the cabin. Elowen, lost in the quiet morning of her past, didn't notice him leave. She stared into the flames, trying to summon the memory of the iron's texture, the weight of it against her skin. But it was fading, eroded by the same current that had claimed the object itself. Hours bled into the night. The storm outside had died down to a low, mournful whistle, leaving the world encased in a tomb of ice. Thaddeus did not return to the cot. Elowen finally drifted into a fitful, shallow sleep, her dreams haunted by the roar of the river. She woke to the sensation of weight shifting near her. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a deep, bruised orange glow. She sat up, her joints protesting, and saw Thaddeus kneeling by the door. He was a wreck. His clothes were frozen stiff, standing up on their own accord. His skin was the color of death, a pale, translucent gray that made the dark bruises on his shoulders stand out in stark relief. His hands were blue, his fingers curled into stiff, trembling claws. He did look up. He simply reached out, his hand uncurling to reveal a small, wet shape in his palm. Elowen gasped. There, resting in his palm, was the iron pendant. It was covered in river silt, tarnished by the freezing water, but it was whole. The iron, forged in the intense, unforgiving heat of a Pennsylvania mill, had survived the river's wrath. She stared at it, tears blurring her vision, unable to find the breath to speak. She looked at Thaddeus, the man who had nearly died to retrieve a piece of metal, a man who had dove into the freezing, lethal dark of the gorge in the dead of night, knowing he might not come back. He didn't wait for her thanks. He didn't wait for her to acknowledge the sacrifice. He simply pressed the pendant into her hand, his fingers icy, trembling, and then, with a soft, ragged sigh, he slumped forward, his head resting against her knee. He was past exhaustion. He was teetering on the edge of collapse. Elowen scrambled, her own fatigue forgotten. She didn't think about her own bruised limbs or the ache in her bones. She hauled him up, draping his massive, shivering form over her shoulder, and moved him toward the warmth of the hearth. She stripped him of his frozen clothes, her hands moving vacape hot, a frantic, desperate efficiency. She wrapped him in every blanket they owned, tucking the wool tight around his shaking frame. She stoked the fire until the room roared vacape hot heat, and then she crawled in beside him, pulling him close, her own body a furnace of warmth against his chilling skin. She held him, her heart swelling with an emotion so fierce it bordered on pain. He had gone to the river, into the dark, into the freezing jaws of the mountain, just to give her back a piece of herself. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking as she pressed her forehead against his chest. "Why would you risk your life for a piece of iron?" Thaddeus didn't open his eyes, but his arm tightened around her, pulling her flush against him. "Because it is yours," he murmured, his voice a ghost of a sound. "And you are mine. That is enough." The words were not a claim of possession. They were a declaration of belonging. The walls were gone. Every doubt, every fear, every hesitation had been washed away by the river and burned away by the fire. They slept like that for a long time, a fragile, perfect peace in the center of a hostile world. But the mountain had one last, cruel lesson to teach them. The sound arrived with the gray, sickly light of dawn. It was the roar of the river, nor the whistle of the wind. It was the sharp, rhythmic clip-clop of horses on the frozen track, a sound that carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of authority. Elowen's eyes snapped open. She sat up. The blankets falling away, her senses instantly alert. She looked toward the window. A group of riders was emerging from the tree line. They were not bounty hunters. They wore the heavy, tan uniforms of the valley lawmen. Coats caped hot, polished brass buttons that caught the morning light like predatory eyes. At their head rode a man with a wide-brimmed hat, his expression grim, his hand resting on the holstered sidearm at his hip. The sheriff. Thaddeus stirred, his eyes sluggishly opening. He followed her gaze, his body going rigid as he saw the lawman dismounting in the clearing. He sat up, his movements slow, his side protesting, but his gaze was clear, hard, and defensive. "Stay here," he rumbled, his voice low. "No," Elowen replied, her hand reaching out to find his. They stood together on the porch. A towering, magnificent pair, the giant mountain man and the giant woman who had survived the forge and the flood. They looked like statues carved from the mountain itself, unyielding and formidable. The sheriff halted at the base of the porch steps. He didn't look at Thaddeus. He looked straight at Elowen. His eyes narrowed, his face etched with the weary, bureaucratic hardness of a man who dealt in papers and mandates, not in the truth of the human heart. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a long, official-looking document. The blue stamp of the federal court, visible even from the porch. "Elowen Forge," the sheriff called out, his voice cutting through the crisp morning air with the authority of the state. Elowen stood tall, her head held high, the iron pendant resting heavy and warm against her collarbone. She did not flinch. "Am she," she replied. The sheriff unfolded the paper. "Mote have a federal warrant for your arrest, issued on behalf of the Pennsylvania Steel Company. Extradition papers were filed 2 days ago, based on reports of grand larceny and fraud." He looked at Thaddeus, his expression softening just a fraction, a look of grim sympathy passing over his face. "And Mort have a second document here," the sheriff continued, his voice dropping slightly. "An injunction against the property owner, Thaddeus Thorne, for aiding and abetting a known fugitive. Not met. Afraid this property is now under federal seizure until the debt is settled." The silence that followed was absolute. The mountain seemed to hold its breath. Thaddeus looked at the sheriff, then back at Elowen. The light in his eyes flickered, the foundation of their sanctuary, crumbling beneath the weight of a piece of paper. He had the strength to fight a bounty hunter, the strength to wrestle a river. But he had no weapon against the cold iron fist of the law. He stepped forward, his massive frame shielding Elowen, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "She is my wife," he said, the words a challenge. The sheriff shook his head, his face hardening. "There are no marriage certificates on file. Thorne. Not here. And not back east. Legally, no. She is a stranger. And according to this warrant, she is a criminal." He gestured to the 2 men behind him. They began to climb the porch steps, their hands hovering near their rifles. Elowen felt the world tilting. She looked at Thaddeus, seeing the naked, devastating fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. The choice was clear. If she resisted, they would kill him. If she went, she would be dragged back to the mills, back to the fire, back to the life that had tried to break her. She looked at her hands, the hands that had held up a roof, that had split frozen timber, that had pulled the man she loved from the jaws of the river. She turned to Thaddeus, her gaze locking with his, a silent, profound goodbye passing between them in the cold morning light. She had spent her life being forged by others. But in this moment, she knew who she was. "Not look long go," she whispered. Her voice calm, resonant, and entirely unafraid. She stepped past Thaddeus, her massive frame moving with the dignity of a queen, and stopped before the sheriff, holding out her wrists to be bound. The cold metal of the manacles bit into Eloan's wrists, a sharp, biting contrast to the warmth of the cabin she had come to call home. She stood on the porch, her broad, muscled frame towering over the sheriff, her head held high in a silent defiance that refused to acknowledge the shame of the bonds. Thaddeus remained behind her, his hand pressed against the doorframe, his side still bandaged, his face a map of controlled, simmering fury. He did not move to strike. He knew the cost of drawing a weapon on a federal officer. The law, with its endless reams of paper and cold, unfeeling stamps, was a cage he had never learned to navigate. The sheriff. A man ve capite hath thin, gray lips and eyes that had seen too much injustice to care for one more, gestured toward the valley. The storm had passed, but the world was still treacherous, slick with the remnants of the spring melt. "The river took the bridge, as you well know," the sheriff murmured, his gaze shifting between Thaddeus and Eloan. "And the mudslides have turned the southern pass into a death trap. Moot cannot risk the transport until the terrain stabilizes. You will be held here until the morning, and then we depart for the valley. From there, the rail takes her east." Thaddeus shifted, his weight moving with a predatory grace despite his injury. "She has done nothing. The steel was stolen by a man in Pennsylvania. She is a victim of his fraud, not a perpetrator." The sheriff sighed, a tired, rasping sound. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, shaking it out. It wasn't the warrant, it was a sheaf of ledger pages, stamped with the mark of the industrial giant that dominated the region. "That may be the truth, Thorne," the sheriff replied, his eyes flickering toward Eloan with a brief, unreadable glimmer of empathy. "But truth has a way of being ignored when money talks. They have named her the primary architect of the theft. They have witnesses, paid or otherwise, who will swear she was at the scene. And more importantly," he paused, looking pointedly at the porch, then back to the interior of the cabin, "they have the legal standing. And you do not." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone that did not reach the deputies standing by the horses. "Mott know what you are to each other. Mott can see it. But the law cares nothing for the mountain. Without a marriage certificate, without a recognized legal union, she is a ghost in the eyes of the court. She has no protection. She is merely a fugitive." Thaddeus felt the floorboards shudder beneath him. The realization hit him with the force of a landslide. He had spent his life keeping the world out, building a sanctuary of stone and timber, but he had forgotten the one thing that actually tethered a life to another: the law. He had thought their bond was enough. He had thought that being man and wife in the eyes of the mountain was all that mattered. He had been wrong. "If Mort provide the funds," Thaddeus began, his voice tight. "If Mort pay the debt, the value of the steel." The sheriff shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. "It is to just the money, Thorne. It's the time. By the time the paperwork is processed, by the time the courts accept your payment as a settlement of the stolen goods, she will have been in a prison cell for months, perhaps years. They've kept a note her punished. They want to set an example." The sheriff motioned for his deputies to secure the area. They began to set up a perimeter around the cabin, their movements efficient, cold, and final. The hours that followed were a waking nightmare. The cabin, once a place of healing and newfound belonging, became a sterile prison. Eloan was forced to sit in the heavy rocking chair by the fire, her hands still bound, her eyes fixed on the flames. Thaddeus was relegated to the cot, watched by a deputy, whose hand never left the grip of his revolver. The tension in the air was absolute. Every sound, the crackle of the fire, the shifting of the deputies' boots on the porch, the rhythmic dripping of the melting roof, felt like a countdown. Thaddeus watched Elowen. He watched the way she sat, her posture stiff, her gaze unyielding. He wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to tell her that it would be all right. But the distance between them felt like an ocean. The legal reality was a wall he couldn't climb, a monster he couldn't fight with an axe or a rifle. He thought of the life he had built, the silence he had cherished, and the way Elowen had shattered it with her strength, her laughter, and her fierce, undeniable spirit. He thought of the iron pendant, the river, the blood he had spilled to keep her safe. He looked at his own hands. They were calloused, knit, scarred, and capable, but they were empty. He was a man of the mountain, a man who built things to last, and yet he was watching everything he had ever valued be dismantled by a piece of paper and a man with a badge. The fire burned low. The sheriff, eventually succumbing to the exhaustion of the journey, retired to the corner of the room, his eyes closing, his hand still resting on his belt. The deputies, huddled near the door, dozed in the flickering light. Thaddeus shifted, his side pulsing with a dull, rhythmic ache. He didn't sleep. He watched the shadows dance across Elowen's face. She was awake, her eyes wide, reflecting the dying embers of the fire. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the heavy, the fine, suffocating silence of the night, they exchanged a look that contained the sum total of their existence, a love that had been forged in the crucible of the frontier, a connection that defied the limitations of their circumstances. It was a look of profound, devastating finality. The moon rose, casting a silver light through the frosted windowpane, illuminating the scene in stark, ghostly detail. The cabin was filled with the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the sleeping men. Thaddeus waited. He waited until the fire was nothing but ash, until the heavy, deep silence of the night claimed the cabin. He waited until the breathing of the sheriff and his deputies changed, slowing into the heavy, unthinking rhythm of deep sleep. He slid his legs off the cot. The movement was slow, deliberate. His side screamed in protest, a white-hot spike of agony that nearly brought him to his knees. He bit his lip, forcing the sound back into his throat, his face draining of all color. He stood, his frame swaying in the darkness. He took a single, shaky breath, steadying himself against the wall. He looked at Elowen. She was watching him, her eyes wide, her lips parted as if to speak. He shook his head. A single, decisive motion. He didn't touch her. He didn't wake her further. He simply turned, his movement silent, ghost-like, and slipped into the shadows of the doorway. He walked toward the table. He reached out, his hand wrapping around the grip of his rifle. He paused, his fingers tracing the wood, the cold metal, the weight of the life he was leaving behind. He looked at the sheriff one last time, the man who held the power to destroy everything he loved, the man who represented a world that had no place for two giants, who had dared to carve a home out of the ice and the pine. Thaddeus moved to the door. He didn't look back at the room. He didn't look at the fire that had kept them warm, or the cot where he had suffered, or the rocking chair where he had seen the woman he loved for the first time. He pushed the door open. The night air, sharp and smelling of snow and pine, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He stepped out onto the porch, his boots making no sound on the wood. He walked down the steps, his gait uneven, his side leaking a slow, steady stream of heat beneath his clothes. He walked toward the horse trough, his movements fluid, determined. He found his horse. The massive, bespoke, dark animal that had carried him through 1,000 miles of mountain track. He laid a hand on its flank, the horse nuzzling against his palm, its breath puffing in the freezing air. He didn't mount. He didn't pack a bag. He didn't check for supplies. He grabbed the reins, his fingers tightening around the leather. He looked back at the cabin one last time, his gaze lingering on the window where Elowen sat in the darkness, the iron pendant resting against her collarbone, a silver star in the night. He turned his back on the cabin. He turned his back on the life he had built, on the man he had been, on the safety of the mountain. He swung himself into the saddle, his side screaming in protest. He leaned forward, his hands resting on the horse's neck. He took one final breath, tasting the cold, clean air of the mountain. And then he spurred the horse into the darkness, his silhouette fading into the shadows of the forest, leaving behind the only thing he had ever truly wanted. The cabin was silent. The fire was dead. And, in the morning, the heavy wooden door would open, and the silence would be the only thing left to greet them. The morning light was a cruel pale gray, filtering through the frosted panes of the cabin like the thin, watery glow of a dying ember. Elowen woke with a start, her senses sharpening before her eyes even opened. The cabin felt hollow. The heavy, comforting presence that usually anchored the room was absent. She sat up, the blankets falling away to reveal the cold, empty cot. Thaddeus was gone. A cold, familiar dread tightened in her chest. The same ache that had followed her from the mills, the same phantom limb of rejection she had carried all her life. He had left. He had seen the law. He had seen the weight of the steel company's reach, and he had made his choice. He had chosen his peace, his silence, and his safety over the towering, complicated burden of a woman who only brought ruin to his doorstep. She stood, her movements heavy, her body aching from the strain of the previous days. The manacles were still on her wrists, clinking softly as she moved. A stark, metallic reminder of her chains. The heavy door creaked. The sheriff stepped inside, his hat in his hand, his eyes scanning the empty cot with a frown. He saw the space where the giant man had been and gave a short, cynical huff of breath. He didn't stick around to say goodbye, the sheriff muttered, his voice devoid of surprise. They never do. Once the law arrives, the mountain men disappear into the timber. You can blame him, most suppose. He had a quiet life before you, and he look lung have a quiet life after you. Elowen didn't answer. She couldn't. The words were a physical blow, a confirmation of the deepest fear she had ever harbored, that, beneath all the strength, beneath all the protection, she was fundamentally unlovable. She was a giant, a brute, a fugitive. She was a woman destined to be left behind. Let's go, the sheriff commanded, gesturing toward the door. We need to make the valley before the mud makes the road impassable. Elowen walked out onto the porch. The world was stark, indifferent, and blindingly bright. The deputies had already mounted their horses, the steam rising from the animals' flanks like smoke. She felt the gaze of the lawman, not unkind, but detached, seeing only a prisoner to be transported. She stood on the wooden boards, the iron maul still leaning against the wall, a silent sentinel of the life she was leaving. She thought of the wood she had split, the roof she had saved, the nights she had spent tending to the man who had promised to protect her. All of it dissolved into nothingness. She moved toward the horses, her step heavy, her spirit fractured. She had accepted her fate. She would go back. She would face the mills. She would let the cold, Gray gears of the industry grind her down until there was nothing left of the woman who had learned to stand tall on a mountain. A sound drifted on the wind, a low, rhythmic thudding of hooves against the mud, growing louder, faster, more desperate. The deputies tensed, their hands dropping to their holsters. The sheriff pivoted, his hand resting on the pommel of his saddle. A rider broke through the tree line. He was riding hard, his horse lathered in white foam. Nostrils flared. The man in the saddle was a whirlwind of exhaustion and lethal intent. He didn't slow down. He spurred the horse straight into the clearing, coming to a sliding, violent halt in the center of the camp. It was Thaddeus. He looked as if he hadn't slept for a month. His clothes were torn. His side was stained with a fresh, dark blotch of blood that had broken through his bandages, and his eyes were wild not with fear, but with a terrifying, absolute focus. "Stop," he roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. The sheriff reached for his weapon, but Thaddeus was faster. He didn't draw a gun. He grabbed a heavy, legal-looking satchel from his saddle and threw it at the sheriff's feet. "Check the papers," Thaddeus demanded, his voice cracking with the strain of his ride. "Check the seal." The sheriff looked at the satchel, then back at Thaddeus, his expression cautious. He signaled his deputies to hold their ground, then dismounted. He picked up the satchel, his fingers working the leather strap. He pulled out the documents. He read in silence, his eyes widening as they scanned the dense, formal text. He looked up at Thaddeus, then down at the papers, then back at Thaddeus again, his jaw dropping in genuine shock. This is the deed to the timber claim," the sheriff whispered, his voice hushed. "And the full release of the steel debt." Thaddeus remained in the saddle, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Elowen. He didn't look like a man who had won. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. "Mort went to the assayer's office in the valley," Thaddeus said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Mort sold the claim, every acre, every stand of timber, every board foot of lumber Mort have spent the last decade accumulating. It was enough to cover the debt claimed by the company. It is all there, verified, stamped, and paid in full." The sheriff looked at the documents, then at the man who had just dismantled his own existence. "Thaddeus, this claim was your life. This was your legacy. You have a thing left. No cabin. No timber. No property." Thaddeus didn't blink. "Moat am not here for the cabin. Moat am here for her." He shifted his gaze to Elowen. The look he gave her was not the look of a hero. It was the look of a man who had stepped off the edge of the world and was waiting to see if there was ground beneath his feet. "You aren't a fugitive," he said softly, his voice trembling for the first time. "And you aren't alone. You are free." The sheriff stood frozen, the papers fluttering in the mountain breeze. He looked from the documents to the man, then to the woman standing in the manacles. He had seen many things in his tenure, but he had never seen a sacrifice of this magnitude. He reached for the key hanging at Moat Fay's belt. With a sharp click, the manacles fell from Elowen's wrists. She stood there, her hands numb, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it felt like it might bruise her skin. She looked at Thaddeus. The reality of his sacrifice began to sink in, cold and crushing. He hadn't left to save himself. He had left to save her. He had stripped away every layer of his identity. The land he loved, the cabin he had built, the security he had worked years to forge, all to ensure that she would never have to return to the fire of the mills. She stepped off the porch, her boots sinking into the mud. She walked toward him, the world blurring around her edges. Thaddeus watched her approach, his expression unreadable. His body slumped in the saddle as the adrenaline began to bleed away. He had given her everything. He had emptied his hands so that she could be whole. She reached the horse, her hands trembling as she reached up, cupping his face. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing, his strength failing him. "You gave it all away," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken sound. "You have nothing left." Thaddeus opened his eyes, looking down at her, his gaze clear, steady, and filled with a raw, terrifying love. "Mote have you," he replied. The sheriff and his men mounted their horses in the distance, their presence beginning to fade into the background. They understood the gravity of the moment, the sacred nature of what had just transpired. They didn't speak. They simply turned their horses and rode away, leaving the two of them alone in the clearing. Elowen stood in the center of the world she had almost lost. The cabin stood behind them, empty, a structure of wood and stone that no longer belonged to either of them. The mountain remained, vast, beautiful, and indifferent. She looked up at the man who had sold his life for her freedom. A man who was now as rootless, as vulnerable, and as exposed as she had been the day she arrived at the station. She realized then that he had not just saved her. He had joined her. He had become a fugitive of his own making. A man who had walked out of his life and into the unknown, trusting that the space between them was enough to hold them both. But as the wind picked up, swirling through the trees, a cold, nagging question began to gnaw at her. They were free. The law would not follow them. The steel company had no claim. But they were also broken. The foundation of their world, the cabin, the land, the security, was gone. Would a woman so used to the hardship of the forge, so desperate for the stability she had never known, be able to build a life with a man who now had absolutely nothing to offer but his own two hands? The silence of the mountain stretched out before them, an open, terrifying, and limitless horizon. They stood in the clearing, two giants who had defied the world, now faced with the most daunting challenge of all. They had to decide, right now, what it meant to have everything, while possessing nothing at all. The silence in the clearing was heavy, but it was no longer the oppressive weight of impending doom. It was the vast, echoing silence of a blank page. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude and later a sanctuary of shared struggle, stood behind them like a discarded shell. Its door hung slightly ajar, rattling in the light breeze, revealing the empty, dusty interior where they had fought for survival, learned the truth of Iages's hot other, and forged a bond that had cost them everything. Thaddeus remained in the saddle, his posture hunched, his head bowed. The loss of his claim was not merely a financial transaction. It was the erasure of the decade he had spent trying to bury his grief in the mountains. He had invested his sweat, his blood, and his very soul into that timber, and now he held nothing but the reins of his horse and the memory of the woman who had watched him dismantle his life. Elowen walked to his horse's side. She placed a hand on his knee, the leather of his trousers worn and cold. She looked up at him, her intense hazel eyes searching the hollows of his face. He looked diminished, shorn of the purpose that had defined his existence for so long. "You sacrificed the foundation of your world," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "And you did it for a woman who has nothing to offer but her own scarred hands." Thaddeus looked down, his gaze softening as it met hers. He didn't pull away. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against the curve of his horse's neck, the exhaustion finally pulling the mask of stoicism from his face. "Mort have spent years measuring my worth in board feet and cabin walls," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely rose above the wind. Mort thought that was the measure of a man. Mot thought, if Mot built enough, if I worked hard enough, the mountain would forgive me for the past. But Mot was building a tomb, Elowen. You are the only thing in this life that has ever felt like a beginning. Elowen felt her chest ache with a profound, overwhelming tenderness. She reached up. Her large, calloused fingers tracing the line of his jaw. Thick, rough, familiar, and infinitely precious. We are not starting with nothing, she stated, her voice gaining strength, ringing with a resonance that demanded to be heard. Moat have my hands. They were forged in the heat of a steel mill, and they know the secrets of iron, of temper, of strength. You have your hands. They have mastered the timber, the forest, and the stone. We are a blacksmith and a builder. We have the skills to carve a life out of any wilderness, provided we have the courage to walk away from the ghosts. Thaddeus lifted his head, his gray eyes searching hers. The hesitation that had haunted him for so long, the fear of failure, the weight of the past, seemed to recede, replaced by a flickering spark of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Genuine hope. We have no supplies, he reminded her. His voice touched with a faint, wry humor. No shelter. No claim. Elowen smiled. And, for the first time, it was a smile that reached her eyes, a genuine, unburdened expression of joy. She squeezed his knee. We have the mountain. And we have each other. That is a foundation. Thaddeus. A better one than any cabin. She turned away from him and walked toward the small pile of supplies she had managed to drag out of the cabin. Before the sheriff had secured the perimeter, it was a meager collection, a heavy woolen blanket, a few dried strips of venison, a canteen of water, and the iron maul she had used to split the hemlock stump. She hoisted the heavy iron tool onto her shoulder, with effortless grace, her muscles surging beneath her dress, the weight of it a comfort in her hand. She stood tall, her towering frame bathed in the golden morning light, looking less like a fugitive and more like a pioneer, standing on the threshold of a new era. Thaddeus watched her, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his past loosening, the chains of his isolation snapping one by one. He did just see a woman. He saw the reflection of the man he could be, the man who did need to hide, who did need to build walls to keep the world out, but who could stand side by side with his equal and face whatever the horizon held. He dismounted, his side protesting, his movements slow. He didn't wait for her to come back. He walked to her, his gait steadying Tehat every step. He stopped in front of her, the massive scale of them dwarfing the clearing. Two giants reclaiming their own narrative. He reached out, his hands taking her face, his thumbs brushing the high, strong line of her cheekbones. The silence between them was no longer heavy or charged with unspoken fears. It was the peaceful, profound silence of a truth finally spoken aloud. Moat was afraid, he confessed. His voice barely a whisper, the vulnerability in his words making the air around them seem to shimmer. Moat was afraid that if Moat gave up the life, Moat knew Moat would lose the only version of myself Moat could tolerate. Moat did not know how to be a man who was loved. Elowen. Moat only knew how to be a man who survived. Elowen leaned into him, her forehead resting against his. She felt the steady rhythm of his heart beneath the layers of his flannel shirt, the heat of his skin, and the strength of his frame. You are not a man who survives, Thaddeus, she murmured, her voice a promise. You are a man who lives, and you will never have to survive alone again. She leaned in, and in the quiet of the mountain morning, with nothing but the forest before them, and the ruin of their past behind them, she pressed her lips to his. It was a kiss that tasted of snow, of wood smoke, and of the profound, earned peace of two souls who had finally found their harbor. It was not a question nor a request, it was a pact. When they parted, the part. Thaddeus looked toward the higher ridges, the path leading deep into the uncharted, untouched peaks. There is a valley, he said, his voice regaining its natural, steady resonance. "Hidden behind the Sawtooth Range. I saw it once, years ago. It has a spring, a stand of cedar, and soil that could grow a garden to feed a village. Mott never thought to go there because it was too far from the trail. Mott I think Mott had enough life in me to make a home that deep in the woods." Elowen followed his gaze, seeing not the insurmountable obstacles, but the potential. She saw the forge she would build, the timber he would fell, and the life they would construct, brick by brick, log by log. "Then we go to the valley," she said, her eyes flashing with a beautiful, indomitable light. She turned to him, her hand sliding into his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, grounding grip that promised he would never let go. They began to walk. They didn't look back at the cabin. They didn't look at the clearing, or the trail, or the path the lawman had taken. They walked forward, into the trees, their silhouettes merging into one against the vast, towering expanse of the mountain. They were two giants in a world that had tried to break them, but they had refused to shatter. They had been forged by the cold, tempered by the river, and strengthened by the weight of their own choices. As they crested the first ridge, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the entire mountain in a brilliant, golden light. It was as if the world itself was acknowledging their resilience, their courage, and the simple, profound truth that love, when it is earned, when it is fought for, and when it is chosen, is the only foundation that can never be seized, never be sold, and never be taken away. They disappeared into the timber, not as fugitives, but as pioneers. The path ahead was steep, the winter was long, and the future was entirely their own to carve. But, as they walked, hand in hand, the forest seemed to open before them, the wind whispering through the pines like a welcoming song. They had lost their claim, their shelter, and their past. But as the mountain air filled their lungs, and the steady, rhythmic crunch of their boots sounded against the earth, they knew the truth. They had finally found everything. The path to the Sawtooth Valley was long, winding, and often treacherous, but, for the first time in their lives, Elowen and Thaddeus walked it without looking over their shoulders. They had left behind the heavy, suffocating weight of industrial debts, false warrants, and the ghost of their own insecurities. What remained was the quiet, deliberate work of building a life that belonged solely to them. The mountain, which had once been a place of isolation, became their canvas. Thaddeus, with his knowledge of the timber and the terrain, guided them through the changing seasons, while Elowen, using the skills of a master forge-born, crafted tools and hearth irons that made the wilderness bloom. Their life became a study in cooperation. They were no longer two giants struggling against a world that feared their stature, but a single, integrated force that respected the boundaries of nature and the sanctity of their partnership. They built their home not of stone and heavy timber, but of cedar and cedar bark, nestled into the slope where the sun hit the earth first each morning. It was a modest home, but it contained a warmth that no amount of gold could purchase. The winters were harsh, as all mountain winters are, but the long nights were spent in the glow of the forge, the rhythmic striking of iron serving as a heartbeat for their sanctuary. They lived with the knowledge that their beginning had been purchased with a great sacrifice. But, as they stood on their porch, watching the sun dip behind the Sawtooth Range, they knew the value of what they had gained. They had discovered that true belonging is not a place, a document, or a fortune. It is the simple, profound act of being known, being seen, and being held by the one person who understands the weight of your history and chooses to share it with you. The mountain stood silent, a witness to their resilience, its peaks forever guarding the story of the timberman and the bride who had turned their empty hands into an empire of iron and cedar. This story is a work of fiction,